Chapter 840. You! Amelia felt that she was going to explode. She had never met a person who made her so angry. Dean leaned against Aisha and sat down, silently calculating the next way out. Now he was in a deadlock. From this moment on, before entering the Earth Dragon Cave, and after leaving the Earth Dragon Cave, he would face ambushes and traps at any time. He could not relax for even a moment. In the blink of an eye, the night came. Amelia's stomach growled, "I want to eat." "Endure it and wait for them to bring it to you." Dean bit the roasted blue fish in his hand and slowly chewed it. Amelia gritted her teeth. "Don't you have food? This is mine." Dean frowned as he felt that she was a bit noisy. Amelia was more annoyed as she saw Dean's disgusted expression. But she knew that getting food from Dean was tantamount to a fool's dream. She was a goddess, so she gritted her teeth and endured. At night, a desolate general knocked on the door and delivered food and a book. "This is what the great priest told me to give to you." General Huang put down the things. "Your Highness, this is your dinner tonight." Dean nodded slightly. After Huang left, he took the book and looked through it. However, Amelie quickly opened the stone basket and saw a few plates of exquisite meat dishes, exuding a tempting aroma. Amelia's eyes lit up as she looked at Dean. "Do you want to eat? This is much better than your broken fish. If you want to eat, then beg me and maybe I can give you a taste." She deliberately fanned the fragrance towards Dean. Dean didn't raise his head. "Don't be long-winded. Go to bed early." Amelia sneered. "What? Are you worried that the food is poisonous? Coward!" Whoosh! Just as she finished speaking, she felt her vision blur. Then, the stone plate in her hand disappeared and fell to the ground. "I don't want to eat, but you can't eat either. Don't mess with me." Dean still didn't raise his head as he said. It seemed that the food had nothing to do with him. Amelia was slightly stunned as she looked at the food that was spilled on the ground. She wanted to pick it up but didn't. She fiercely stared at Dean. "Wait till you fall into my hands, then I will make you beg for death." She no longer paid attention to Dean as she held the remaining plates of food and ate with relish. Dean was gradually attracted by the contents of the book. It was about the Earth Dragon Cave, including the date of the Earth Dragon Cave, the reason, as well as the appearance and characteristics of the wasteland worms inside. The opening date of the Earth Dragon Cave isn't a special day. It's just to restrict the villagers from entering the cave at will. It's to protect the worm and the villagers. Worm likes blood? How can there be blood in the cave? The worm in the outer layer of the Earth Dragon Cave is relatively weak, and the number is sparse. The deeper you go, the denser they are. The worm's strength is determined by the size. The bigger the worm, the stronger it is. There are some special cases. Although they are small in size, they are still very powerful. Such special cases can be distinguished by the color of the antennae. Yellow antennae are weaker and red antennae are stronger. Dean carefully looked at the book. Although it introduced a lot of useful information, it seemed that some key things were not explained. For example, what was the deepest part of the Earth Dragon Cave? Why would the worm live in the Earth Dragon Cave? Where did the worm come from? Why was the Earth Dragon Cave called the Earth Dragon Cave? Could it be that there was an Earth Dragon hidden inside? Dean didn't get the answer to the questions in the book, so he could only ask Amelia. The deepest part of the Earth Dragon Cave? I don't know. Anyway, there must be a lot of worm. Do you want to go to the deepest part? Don't court death. Amelia unceremoniously hit Dean. If you don't answer well, then you may not be able to eat for the next few days. Dean calmly said. Amelia stared at him. Don't you dare. But thinking about it, Dean really dared to do so. She quickly compromised. In fact, I don't know. I haven't been a goddess for a long time. There are a lot of things that I haven't learned yet. You can ask the great priest. Dean stared at her. 14 or 15 years old and you don't even understand these things. Do you think I'm retarded or do you think you are retarded? How can you talk like that? Amelia was angry. Dean looked at her and took back his eyes. Forget it. Anyway, we will know when we get there. Amelia was surprised. Do you really want to go to the deepest part? Dean turned around and ignored her. Amelia came in front of Dean and said in a serious tone, I advise you not to court death. If you want to die, then don't take me with you. Don't you want to verify whether the worm can enhance your strength? Why don't you catch a few small ones and eat them? Why go to such a deep place and take the risk? If we provoke the worm swarm, then both of us will be eaten. Dean turned again. I have a sense of propriety. Shut up and go to sleep. You. Amelia gritted her teeth in anger. Time passed quickly. In the blink of an eye, it was time for the dragon cave to open. Dean had read in the book that the opening day of the dragon cave wasn't a special day. He could ask the great priest to open the cave for him in advance. It would save a lot of unnecessary trouble. But he wasn't sure if the information in the book was true or false. In case it was deliberately tempting him to do so, then he would fall into a trap. So to be cautious, he went in with the other villagers. I can finally see the sunlight outside. Amelie walked out of the house and stretched herself comfortably. During this time, she and Dean had been staying in the house, not even going out of the door. It was almost suffocating. Sunshine? The light is more like it, Dean said as he held Aisha's hand and put the other hand on Amelia's shoulder. Don't play tricks. Don't ask for trouble. Amelia felt awkward as Dean put his hand on her shoulder. She rolled her eyes but was too lazy to respond. She was used to Dean's cynicism these days. It didn't take long for two wilderness generals to come in front of them. Your Highness, the great priest has asked you to come over. Let's go, Amelia said indifferently. She restored the noble temperament of the goddess. The two generals frowned as they looked at Dean's hand on her shoulder. They didn't say anything as they slightly bent down and led the way. The dragon cave was located on the most remote hillside on the west side of the village. There were wooden stakes outside the cave. Each stake was connected to a rope which sealed the place. No one would come here on weekdays as it was regarded as a forbidden area. But today it was the most lively place. The open space outside the hillside was full of people when Dean and the goddess arrived. More than 90% of the villagers had come here to watch. It's the goddess. The goddess has come. I heard that the goddess has been teaching the outsider for the past few days. I hope the outsider can understand the teachings of the goddess and be a good person. Get out of the way. Dean and Amelia's arrival attracted the attention of the crowd. The crowd immediately separated to make a path for Dean and Amelia to pass. Dean also put down his hand from her shoulder. Before coming here, he had whispered to her that if she played tricks, everyone present would be buried with her. Amelia naturally didn't dare to risk escape in such a chaotic place. She knew that she wasn't Dean's opponent. If she angered Dean, then he would indiscriminately kill the innocent villagers. That would be a great loss. Benefactor, Prelay called out loudly from within the crowd. Dean nodded slightly as he saw Prelay. Prelay smiled as he saw the eyes of the crowd. He was quite proud of himself as he smiled. The villagers calmed down as Dean led Amelia and Aisha to the front of the crowd. But they were still whispering to each other. Other people who participated in the dragon cave frequently looked at Dean and Amelia. Chapter 841. Amelie. Great priest came in front of Amelie and looked at her. Pay attention to your safety. I will. Amelie took a deep breath and a serious expression appeared on her face. She slowly stepped forward and said, Let's go in. Dean looked at the great priest but didn't speak. He took Aisha and Amelie's hands and took the lead to enter the cave. Other villagers lined up and were ready to enter as they came to the front of the cave. It was dark inside the cave. The light from the top of the rock wall could not shine in, but Dean could still see the scene inside the cave through his night vision ability. The inside was full of rubble, and the rock wall was extremely smooth. It seemed to be the trace of mucus drying up. Dean let go of Aisha and let her follow him. He held the splitter in one hand and Amelie's shoulder with the other. He slowly walked in. It was extremely quiet inside the cave, but if one listened carefully, one could hear a very slight sound of friction. This sound was slippery and made one feel disgusted, as if something sticky was rubbing against one's body. He stared into the depths of the cave and could not see any heat source, but he could tell from the subtle sound that there was something not far ahead. He didn't dare to be careless as it was the first time he faced a wild worm. He used his X-ray ability to the extreme and soon saw that there were a few finger-long worms squirming in the rock wall about 70 or 80 meters away. The worm looked like a shellless snail. There was a smell of mucus under its body, and its whole body was smooth. It seemed that it didn't have any attack power. Is this a wild worm? Dean slowly walked over with Amelie. When they were about 10 meters away from the worms, they seemed to be alarmed. They raised their heads like vipers and turned to look at Dean's position. The next moment they crawled out of the nest. They crawled like caterpillars, but every time they crawled, their body was stretched to about half a meter. The speed of their wriggling was very fast. They would arrive in front of Dean in 10 seconds. Wild worms. There was a trace of panic on Amelie's face when she saw the worms wriggling over. She gritted her teeth and said to Dean, "Attack! Don't let them come close. They can spit corrosive fluid." Dean had read about the abilities of wild worms in the book. Spitting corrosive fluid was just one of their abilities. Different worms could spray different liquids. Some liquids could cause frostbite, some could corrode rocks, and some could stretch their body to entangle their prey like a snake, and strangle them to death. Dean looked at Amelia and said, "I'll leave them to you." She was not mentally prepared. After all, she had never been to the Earth Dragon Cave. She only knew about the appearance of the worm from the great priest. This was the first time she saw these ugly worms with her own eyes. As a girl, she had a natural fear of worms. If it was not for the mission in her heart, she would have turned around and run away. However, Dean was crazy enough to ask her to attack. She didn't have any weapons with her. Amelie's legs trembled as she looked at the worms wriggling closer. Dean raised his eyebrows as he saw her. He didn't expect that as a goddess she couldn't even deal with a few worms. Her fighting ability wasn't as good as an average villager. After all, Prelay had said that he could deal with 1 or 2 small worms at the same time. The ones in front of him were small worms. Amelie was scared as the insects were getting closer and closer. Dean no longer counted on her. He picked up a few stones from the ground and threw them out. The stones flew out almost at the same time, but they were aimed at several insects in different positions. All of them were hit. However, after the stones hit the worms, they quickly sank. 2 of the stones accurately hit the heads of the 2 worms, which were wriggling forward. Their heads were directly smashed, but the next moment, the stones sank into their bodies, and their heads quickly recovered and continued to wriggle toward Dean. Dean slightly raised his eyebrows. As the book said, ordinary physical attacks were ineffective against them. He stepped out and turned his wrist slightly. A few black lights appeared in the cave, and the worms that were squirming over were immediately cut off. At the same time, the 2 parts of their bodies were separated by Dean. In the blink of an eye, the 5 worms on the ground became 10. They were like snakes with a broken tail, jumping on the ground, but there was no blood flowing out of the wounds. "Go and catch them," Dean ordered Amelie. Amelie was relieved when she saw that the worms were severely injured by Dean. However, she still felt nauseous as she looked at their wriggling appearance. She suppressed the fear in her heart and took out a special jar from her backpack. She picked up a severed worm and quickly threw it into the jar. Then she closed the jar. She heard the jar in her hand as half of the worm was bumping into each other. She wiped the mucus off her fingers and returned to Dean with the jar. "It will die soon. Do you want to eat it?" "You eat it first," Dean said. He had learned about the method of using the worm from the books, Prelay and other villagers. The answer he got was very consistent. It was to wash and eat it directly. There was no need to pay attention to it. Eat it like food and then become stronger. I don't want to eat it. Amelie's face was ugly. Not to mention eating it, even looking at it would make her scalp tingle. Dean coldly glanced at her. Don't force me to grab a whole worm and stuff it into your mouth. Amelie looked at Dean's indifferent expression and shuddered. She knew that when Dean used this expression to talk to her, he would do what he said. This man was definitely not a soft-hearted person. She clenched her teeth as she felt humiliated in her heart. Time passed. The scattered worms on the ground were still bouncing in the same place. Some of them gently wriggled and crawled towards Dean. Dean used the tip of the knife to push away the worm that was crawling in front of him. He quietly waited for the worm in her hand to suffocate to death. Yes, the worm was not afraid of sword attacks. However, it was easy to suffocate to death. In this regard, they were similar to the vast majority of creatures on Earth. They had a high dependence on oxygen. After a few minutes, the jar in Amelie's hand gradually calmed down. Eat it, Dean urged impatiently. Amelie's body slightly trembled. She hesitated for a moment and slowly opened the jar. She saw half of the worm at the bottom of the jar. It was motionless. Its body had returned to the size of half a finger. Her face was very ugly. She trembled as she stretched out her fingers to take out the worm. The sticky feeling from her fingers made her want to vomit. She instinctively wanted to look up and beg Dean. However, Dean's indifferent face flashed in her mind. She clenched her teeth and endured it. She closed her eyes and stuffed the worm into her mouth. In an instant, she felt that she was going to die. That taste, that feeling, it made her feel more pain than death. She chewed the worm's body. The worm's body split open. It was like the internal organs had ruptured. The taste was fishy and bitter. She felt her stomach churn. She couldn't bear it anymore and vomited. She bent over and coughed hard. She vomited all the fine meat that she had eaten before. The thing that she vomited exuded a sour smell. Dean slightly frowned and took the jar from her hand. He picked up another struggling worm from the side and threw it into the jar. He covered the lid and waited for the worm to die while waiting for her to recover. Your villagers risked their lives to get this thing. Now it is in front of you. You have to know how to cherish it. Dean said to her. How could Amelie not know that these worms were incomparably precious? However, eating them was worse than killing her. She really wanted to cry. At this moment, she even wished that she was just an ordinary girl in the village, because women did not need to come to caves. This was a tradition. Soon, she was tired and wiped her mouth. At this time, Dean handed her the jar. The worm inside was suffocated to death. Eat it. There was fear in Amelie's eyes. She looked at Dean but saw his indifferent expression. She clenched her teeth and tears filled her eyes. She trembled as she opened the jar and took out the worm. The stench hit her face and she almost vomited again. But this time she gritted her teeth and held back. She threw the worm into her mouth and chewed it quickly. This time she didn't chew much. She just chewed a few mouthfuls and swallowed the worm. The moment she swallowed the worm, she felt like she was relieved. Dean didn't say anything as he saw her eat it. He picked up another worm and threw it into the jar. Amelie felt like she was about to collapse as she saw Dean's action. She clenched her teeth and her eyes were full of hatred. After a few minutes, the worm inside the jar was suffocated to death. When Amelie was ready to take it, Dean directly opened the jar. He used 2 slender fingers to pick up the worm and threw it into his mouth. He chewed a few times and swallowed it. After eating, Dean didn't look at Amelie. He bent down and picked up another struggling worm. He stuffed it into the jar and said to Amelie, "The people behind us are coming. Let's go." Amelie was shocked as she saw Dean's calm expression. She subconsciously looked at the remaining worms on the ground. What about these? She regretted as she was afraid that Dean would pick them up and let her eat them. Let's leave them for the people behind us. Let's go inside and see, Dean said as he used a knife to push away the worms on the ground. Chapter 842. After walking for about 40 or 50 meters, Dean cut off 7 or 8 worms. These worms were gray in color, and only one of them was completely black. This black worm would spit out a corrosive liquid that could corrode rocks from afar. Soon, a fork appeared in front of Dean. Dean chose to go straight. The straight road was the path to the deepest part of the cave. The other road was opened up by the wild worm over a long period of time. Most of the villagers would go to the other road. For the villagers, as long as they could catch the wild worm, it was enough. Only a few arrogant people would take the straight road. They wanted to go to the deepest part of the Earth Dragon cave to take a look and prove their courage. After walking for more than 20 meters, Amelia suddenly groaned in pain. She squatted down and covered her stomach. Dean calculated the time in his mind. 5 or 6 minutes had passed. It should be time to see the effect. Generally, eating the worm would take effect in about 5 to 10 minutes. Amelia curled up in pain. Her body trembled slightly. After less than 10 seconds, she calmed down and quickly stood up from the wet ground. She was surprised to see her hands. Dean noticed that the heat in her body had increased a lot. At first, her body was no different from an ordinary person. But in a short time, it had reached the level of a primary hunter. This surprised him. Was this little goddess really just an ordinary person at the beginning? Was she not deliberately hiding the heat? If this was the case, then the benefits brought by the worm were too strong. However, he remembered what Prelay and the other villagers had said. Eating a wild worm for the first time was a very painful experience. The pain would last for half an hour before disappearing. Only then would one's strength increase. Only by consuming it multiple times would the effect shorten. In the later stages of eating wild worms, the pain would only last for a few minutes, but Amelie only lasted about 10 seconds. The difference was too big. Haven't you eaten this thing before? Dean narrowed his eyes. He suspected that Amelia was pretending. But thinking of the vomiting reaction when she ate the worm, he felt that it was not the case. Unless the girl's acting was Oscar level. Amelia shook her head as she heard Dean's words. She was about to answer when she realized the reason behind Dean's question. She frowned and bowed her head in silence. Dean raised his eyebrows. You'd better answer my questions. Otherwise I don't mind letting your body have more intimate contact with these insects. Amelie's expression changed. She gritted her teeth and said, You're so evil. Be careful that you don't fall into hell. That's after death. You don't have to worry about it. Dean narrowed his eyes. Most people won't be able to take effect so quickly unless you have taken it many times. Or you are a goddess. Although I don't know why your village selected you, but there should be some differences between you and ordinary villagers. You better be honest, or I will strip your clothes and bring the bugs to you. Let the bugs taste the blood of the goddess. You! Amelia's body trembled as she heard Dean's shameless words. Her face turned white and red. Yes, I'm different from everyone else. So I can digest the worms faster. Are you satisfied with this answer? What's the difference? Dean asked. She wanted to keep the secret, but now it seemed that it was impossible. She raised her head and looked at Dean. I'm the child of the origami. I have the blood of the origami in my body, so I can easily digest these worms. Moreover, I'm not afraid to tell you that these worms are very interested in my blood. Bringing me here is your biggest mistake because the worms will smell my scent. The deeper you go, the more worms you will encounter. You might even encounter a tide of worms. Dean nodded. Amelie was angry and wanted to stomp her feet. She wanted to keep the secret, but now it seemed that it was impossible. But she wasn't afraid that Dean would abandon her. After all, they were not far from the entrance of the cave. Dean was startled. Child of origami? Was she a descendant of the war god's family? He couldn't help but look at Amelia. The war god's family was more than 10 meters tall. Their lower body was distorted, but Amelia's height and appearance was no different from a normal person. If you are the child of origami, then what is the great priest? Dean stared at her. Amelia snorted. Of course I'm also the child of origami. Dean narrowed his eyes. Since you are the children of origami and your digestive ability is so strong, why haven't you eaten a worm before? If you want, you should be able to become the strongest person here. Amelia's face changed. Dean's question was too sharp. Although Dean's question might be unintentional, but if she answered honestly, then it would expose a lot of things, including the weakness of the great priest. Her eyes flashed. I'm the goddess. Even if I'm not the strongest in the village, everyone has to respect me. Why should I eat these disgusting worms? Really? Dean stared at her eyes. The goddess was also looking at Dean. Time seemed to stop at this moment, but Dean didn't blink. His sharp eyes seemed to pierce into the depths of her soul. Amelia's heart pounded as she looked at him for a long time. She slowly turned her head. It's up to you whether you believe me or not. Dean deeply looked at her. I have a guess, but I don't know if it's true or not. You said that it was your first time eating a worm, and I believe it. But the reason why you didn't eat it before is not because it's disgusting, but because you didn't want to increase your strength. Because the stronger your physique is, the stronger the smell will be and the greater the attraction to the worms. At that time, the worms won't stay here. That's why you didn't increase your strength. From this point I can guess that the great priest is different from you. She isn't the child of origami. Otherwise, why is she the goddess and the great priest? Amelia's heart turned cold as she listened to Dean's words. Everything was correct. She didn't expect that Dean's speculation would be completely correct. Dean was basically sure as he saw her reaction. His ability to read people's expressions had been tempered to perfection in the giant wall. Amelia's acting skills weren't Oscar level. After all, she was just a teenage girl. Although her mind was much smarter than the average person, but she didn't have much experience in this small village. The child of origami. Your ancestor should be a combination of human and origami? Dean speculated again. Amelia's body trembled because Dean was right. She looked up at Dean and saw his dark eyes. She felt as if she was completely seen through. She asked, "How do you know?" This secret wasn't a big deal, as she was powerless to argue. Your mind doesn't look like a person who has lived for decades. From this point of inference, your age and appearance are consistent. The origami has been dead for hundreds of years. Your father gave birth to you, which means that your father was a human. But you are still the child of the origami. It can only mean that you have half of the origami's bloodline in your body. From this it can be inferred that your ancestors were a combination of the origami and humans. Dean said. Amelia was startled. She felt that it wasn't difficult to speculate her identity after hearing Dean's word. She felt a little better in her heart, but she was still angry that Dean could see through so many of her secrets. She gritted her teeth. Who said that I haven't lived for decades? How much older are you than me? Humph. You have to call me brother even if you are 1 year older. Dean no longer paid attention to her angry words. He turned his head and looked around. He felt a faint movement coming from the front of the cave. Something was slowly approaching. Most likely it was a worm. She was about to move forward when she found that she had overlooked one thing. Chapter 843. Dean raised his arm and looked down at his body, feeling the changes in his body. Time passed minute by minute. After waiting for about 2 minutes, he still did not feel any changes. His face slightly changed. He was surprised. Could it be that the wild worm was ineffective on him? Or, his physique was much stronger than Amelie and the other villagers, so the small wild worm had no effect on him? While he was thinking, suddenly, a burst of cold air spread out from his right arm. His frozen right arm suddenly seemed to awaken. Cold blood flowed through his arm and flowed into his body. It was so cold that he shivered slightly, as if he was in an ice cave. Dean's face slightly changed. He immediately stimulated his heart, using the dragon blood technique to speed up the heartbeat and enhance the blood circulation in his body. After a while, the cold air was slightly dispelled, but the cold blood that flowed into his body through his right arm had spread to his whole body. He felt his body temperature plummeting, and he was indescribably cold. He thought of the fate of Dragon Mother, and didn't dare to hesitate. He quickly opened his backpack, took out a bottle of white wine, and drank 3 mouthfuls. The difference between wine and water was that the wine was cold, but it was very hot when it entered the body. The alcohol burned in Dean's throat and chest, bringing bursts of hot feeling, which dispelled a lot of the cold air in his body. At least he wouldn't shiver and his nerves wouldn't tremble. "What's wrong with you?" Amelie saw Dean's abnormality and asked in astonishment. Dean gently shook his body, using the resonance of his muscles to generate heat. His face was gloomy, and he didn't pay attention to Amelie's words. His heart gradually sank. His right arm wouldn't attack unless it was in an extremely cold environment. Usually, under his careful control, his right arm would move normally, but now it suddenly attacked. The only change was that he ate the wild worm. In other words, the wild worm would cause the cold air in his right arm to attack. He didn't know the reason, but he didn't feel any increase in strength in his body, which was enough to confirm his judgment. For them, eating the wild worm can strengthen their physique, but I ate it, and it almost caused the ice blood disease to attack. Will this trip be in vain? Dean suddenly thought of something and said to Amelie, "Wait here, I'll be back soon." Then, without waiting for Amelie's reply, he turned and ran away. Half a minute later, he ran back. Amelie's visual visibility was extremely low in the dark cave. Even after eating the worm, she could only see less than 2 meters around her. Moreover, it was a vague shadow. She felt a sense of security when she saw Dean appear again. She secretly felt that she was ridiculous and pathetic. "Where have you been?" she asked. Dean automatically ignored her question. "Let me ask you. Do the people in your village have the bloodline of origami? Or should I say, in these hundreds of years of reproduction, their ancestors had married someone with the bloodline of the origami?" Amelie was startled. She frowned and said, "Why do you ask? Yes or no?" Dean stared at her. His ears slightly moved as he turned his head. The faint movement he had heard before was getting clearer. 50 meters away from the corner, more than a dozen wild worms were crawling towards him. There were 2 wild worms mixed in with them. Dean believed that Amelie could hear the sound of the wild worms, so he said in a cold voice, "You better answer honestly." Amelie saw the naked threat in Dean's eyes. She was angry and aggrieved. "If you say yes, then so be it." It seemed that his speculation was correct. Most of the ancestors of the villagers had a marriage with Amelie's ancestor. That was the offspring of the origami. This marriage had led to the appearance of a close relative marriage. He had learned about the strange marriage system from Prele. At this moment, he had confirmed that the villagers were basically regarded as a family. Their bodies more or less had the genes of the origami. Amelie should be regarded as the orthodox descendant of the origami. The other villagers were just a branch. This was the only explanation that made sense. Why Amelie and the villagers could increase their strength after eating the wild worms, but he couldn't. He had left to check if the people who came in later had picked up the wild worms that he had cut off. The result was that all the wild worms were gone. This confirmed his speculation. However, he still couldn't figure out why his right arm would be stimulated even if he couldn't increase his strength after eating the wild worms. What would be the reaction of an outsider who ate the wild worms? Or would there be no reaction and it would just fill the stomach? Amelie saw that Dean was silent. She didn't know if her words had exposed something. She carefully looked at Dean. "What's wrong with you? Are you stupid?" Dean recovered and looked at her. "I remember that you said that the deepest part of the cave is the body of the origami, right?" Amelie was startled. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to take a look," Dean said. He had given up the plan to continue to catch wild worms to enhance his strength. This trip was in vain. He had been delayed in the village for more than a month. Moreover, he had kidnapped the little girl and offended the whole village. However, since it was like this, he was not afraid to offend them further. He couldn't go back empty-handed. If he could find the body of the origami in the deepest part of the cave, then it would be a big harvest. At least, the body of the origami was also an extremely precious and rare existence. If he could get the body of the origami, it would mean that he could get rid of the giant wall of Sylvia. He could choose any place in the wilderness and build his own shelter. This shelter was completely his territory. Even the kingdom of God wouldn't be able to find him. It was convenient for him to do a lot of things. Even if he didn't have the energy to build such a shelter after he got the body of the origami, he would continue to hide in the giant wall. But the body of the origami would be infinitely valuable. At least this level of things was enough to make the big shots of the kingdom of God jealous. After all, the other giant wall had sent people to seize the body of the origami. Let's go. Dean held the sword and strode forward with Aisha. Amelie's face was ugly. Do you want to die? The deeper we go, the more insects there will be. I know you have the ability, but you can't stop the swarm of insects. If I die, you won't be able to get out of here. You can try if you don't believe me. Use your life to try? I don't mind, Dean said without looking back. Amelie was almost choked to death by his words, but her body was very honest. She followed closely behind Dean for fear of leaving her body. Before entering the Earth Dragon Cave, she was ready to die together with Dean. But after seeing these twisted and hideous worms, she was a little afraid. She shuddered at the thought of being bitten to death by these worms. So now her mind was very chaotic. Instinctively, she followed Dean, still planning to find an opportunity to hit Dean hard. Dean rushed to the front of more than a dozen wild worms and quickly slashed with his sword. His figure flashed like a phantom. More than a dozen wild worms didn't have time to spit out corrosive liquid and freezing liquid before their bodies were cut off. At the same time, their soft bodies were slapped against the rock wall and slid down. Dean went forward without looking back. Follow me if you don't want to die. If I can't protect you, then you will become a snack for these insects. Amelie's face turned ugly. She knew that they were still on the periphery. Once they went deeper, they would have to face more worms. Sooner or later, Dean wouldn't be able to take care of her. Sacrifice, glory, sacrifice, glory. Amelie clenched her teeth as she cheered herself up. Chapter 844. About 50 meters into the cave, they came to a corner. Dean looked forward but still couldn't see the end of the cave. The cave in front of him was densely packed with wild worms. All of them were like dogs that smelled a strange smell. They wriggled out from the crevices and the ground. They raised their heads like snakes and looked at Dean and Amelie. The wild worm was like an earthworm. There were no eyes on both ends, only a round hole that looked like a mouth. It looked disgusting, especially when these things looked at him in groups. It was disgusting and horrifying. Amelia's face turned pale as she subconsciously hid behind Dean. She saw Aisha standing next to him on the right side. Although she knew that Aisha was a corpse and didn't know fear, but a strange feeling emerged in Amelie's heart. The next moment, all the wild worms left the nest and swarmed towards Dean. Their originally finger-length bodies were stretched to half a meter long. They wriggled forward in a bow shape. Their speed was slightly faster than an ordinary adult's walking speed. When they were 4 or 5 meters in front of Dean, a wild worm raised its body and sprayed transparent mucus from the round hole in front of it. The speed was extremely fast. It was like a water gun shooting towards Dean. Dean quickly rushed up and avoided the transparent mucus shooting. He picked up the wild worm and cut its body. Although it couldn't kill them, but it could limit their movement. According to Prelay and the books, the simplest way to kill a wild worm was to cut its body in half. If it was cut horizontally, it wouldn't die on the spot. Instead, after a long time, the wound would heal and the two parts of the body would slowly grow into 2 wild worms. However, in order to cut it vertically, The twisted body of the wild worm had to be straightened and fixed. Although Dean didn't need to fix the body of the wild worm, he could cut it in half with his knife skills. But he needed to concentrate and waste more time. So directly cutting off the body was the best way. Soon, Dean opened a path among the wild worms. He shook the bell and let Aisha follow him. Amelie didn't need Dean to say more. She quickly followed behind Aisha. Dean went all the way forward. Everywhere he went, there were broken bodies of wild worms on the ground. "How deep is it?" Dean asked as he walked and killed. Amelie looked at the half-insect that flew around her from time to time. She was so nervous that her face was pale. "I don't know, but I heard that it's very, very deep." Dean slightly frowned. At this time, he continued to go nearly 50 meters deeper. The number of wild worms in front of him was increasing. Some rock walls were covered with a layer of dense wild worms. When they were motionless, they would even think that they were part of the rock wall. But when Dean came, they slowly wriggled and woke up. It was like the front of the rock wall was twisting. It looked exceptionally terrifying. In addition to the large number, the size of the worm was also a lot bigger. Dean finally realized how courageous it was for the ordinary villagers to come here to hunt the worm. Whoosh! A black worm jumped out of the rock wall like a viper and quickly wrapped around Dean's thigh. It slithered up towards his crotch. Dean quickly raised his hand and pulled it down. He threw it into the cave behind him and continued to move forward. Hiss! Among the worms, several snow-white worms quickly swam toward Dean. They were not arched but twisted like snakes. Their bodies were thick like baby arms, about 1 meter long and smooth. In the process of swimming, the front half of their body was slightly raised, and the soft tissues under their round body extended out, turning into 2 sharp blades. Like the arms of a mantis, they quickly swam toward Dean. Their speed was faster than primary hunters. Dean's face slightly changed. This should be regarded as a strong wild worm. Although the general wild worm was very strong and could spit out mucus that could corrode the body and armor, but after all, it was slow. Ordinary people could avoid it. But this kind of wild worm was like a killer. Ordinary people would die if they encountered it. What surprised him the most was that the body of the wild worm had changed. Its round body tissues could unexpectedly turn into sharp blades. Whoosh! Dean waved his sword and cut off several snow-white wild worms that were swimming towards him. In front of the Dominator level, the movement of these wild worms was as slow as a tortoise. Dean picked up a severed snow-white blade worm and said, "Open the jar." Amelie's face turned pale, but she quickly opened the jar in her arms. Dean threw the slightly twisting half of the worm into the jar. Amelie quickly covered it. Dean turned around and continued to kill. At the same time, he said, "Wait until it is suffocated. Then you can eat it." Amelie's face became uglier, but she knew that it was useless to argue. She could only hold the jar and firmly follow behind Dean. In the blink of an eye, they continued to go hundreds of meters deeper. At this time, Dean found that the number of wild worms he encountered had decreased. However, the size of the wild worms had increased. The gray wild worms that he encountered outside the cave had disappeared. The wild worms that appeared in front of him were as thick as an adult's arm. They were 1 meter long. But when they swam over, their round body was like a machine. 7 or 8 sharp blades suddenly appeared in the soft tissues. Some of the wild worms even had 2 short fleshy wings on their back. They flapped their bodies to fly. They were like dragonflies that were magnified hundreds of times. Dean waved his sword and quickly went forward to cut them into several pieces. Although the large wild worm was strong, but its speed was similar to the limitless. In front of him, it could only be regarded as a small monster. "It's so deep." Dean stepped over the body of the worm. He was shocked in his heart. From the outside of the cave to here, he had walked about 200 meters. This distance was nothing, but if it was a 200-meter-high building, he could feel how long it was. Generally speaking, the caves of monsters were at most 30 meters deep. Whoosh! A wild worm was hanging upside down from the top of the cave. It fiercely spat out a mucus that hit the ground in front of Dean's feet. But Dean found that the mucus touched the rock in front of his feet. It quickly dissolved and collapsed, turning into a small pit. He was shocked. The speed of corrosion was too fast. Even the aqua regia from the old era wasn't so terrifying. Previously, the corrosive liquid spat out by the wild worm could only slightly corrode the rock, so Dean didn't care too much about it. But this wild worm was different. Dean recognized its appearance and rushed forward like a phantom, cutting it down. Dean cut it into 3 pieces. He picked the middle section and threw it to Amelie. "Eat it later." Amelie looked at the arm-thick section of the wild worm. Her face turned green. She had swallowed the white-blade wild worm that was suffocated to death. She didn't expect to eat such a big one. Dean continued to move forward. Barren worms popped out of the cave one after another and swam toward Dean. Dean quickly said. At the same time he was attacking, he also noticed that almost all the worms were rushing towards Amelia's direction. Although Amelia was standing behind him, the worm had no eyes and was aiming at Amelia. It seemed that Amelie and her clansmen could eat the wild worms to become stronger. The wild worms were also very interested in their meat. Dean walked along the winding cave and suddenly stopped. He saw that the inner wall of the cave had suddenly expanded to accommodate 5 or 6 people at the same time. But in the middle of the cave there was a sturdy dark wild worm. Dean's eyes narrowed. This was the biggest wild worm he had seen so far. There was no record of such a big wild worm in the books given by the great priest. The worm seemed to be sleeping. When Dean saw it, it seemed to smell something. Its body slowly moved, and the coiled end of its body lifted, looking at Dean's direction. Chapter 845. Dean looked at the slowly recovering worm and said to Amelia, "Stay here and don't move." Amelia was nervous as she saw that Dean was about to leave. It was dark here. She had eaten 2 worms and her strength had increased, but her field of vision was still limited to 3 to 5 meters. She didn't know what Dean had found. Dean carried his sword and rushed towards the worm. The worm was completely alarmed by Dean's action. It quickly untied its body. Its body was nearly 3 meters long. The round hole on its raised head suddenly expanded and split vertically from the inside, revealing a ferocious mouth full of sharp teeth. The mouth was slightly open, and one could see that the inside of the mouth was pitch black. The sharp teeth extended to the depths of the mouth. It seemed that the whole body was densely covered with sharp teeth. It screamed and quickly swam towards Dean. Dean narrowed his eyes and suddenly accelerated. He raised the sword in his hand and cut off the head that was about to bite him. He turned his wrist and lifted the sword in the opposite direction, cutting off the middle part of the body. After a few slashes, the body of the wild worm was quickly cut into several pieces. Although it was quickly solved, Dean's eyes were still dignified. This worm was extremely fast. It was faster than all the other worms he had met before. It was comparable to the pioneer level. He didn't know if this was the strongest worm here. If there were stronger worms in the depths, then it was likely to be at the inner wasteland level. Or even, there might be sovereign-level worms. He didn't dare to be careless. He turned to Amelia and said, "Come here." Amelia heard Dean's voice from the cave. She was relieved and immediately rushed forward. Soon Aisha and Amelia came to Dean's side. The difference was that Aisha was summoned by Dean with the bell. Amelia's face was very bad as she saw the huge worm that was still twisting on the ground. Her first thought was, how could there be such a big worm? Her second thought was, how could she eat such a big worm? Dean saw her eyes and said, "Do you want to try it?" Amelia quickly shook her head like a rattle drum. "Let's go." Dean continued to move forward. Not long after, the view of the cave suddenly widened. In front of him was a wide cave similar to the underground world. On the ground and on the wall, There were 4 or 5 wild worms that were as thick as the previous one. Dean was surprised. He told Amelie to wait for him in the same place and took the initiative to rush towards the worms. Several wild worms reacted quickly after being alarmed. They immediately hissed and rushed toward Dean. Dean's figure was divided into 3. His sword flashed and several worms that were rushing towards him were quickly dealt with. Dean was relieved, but his mood was a bit heavy. His previous guess seemed to be true. If he encountered a Dominator-level worm, then he would have to let Aisha cooperate with him on the premise of not getting injured. But this was the last thing he wanted to do. In the wilderness, getting injured would increase the chance of death to more than 70%. The cave was very wide. It was as if he had returned to the village world outside the dragon cave. The dome of the cave was more than 10 meters high. The surrounding rock walls were stained with viscous liquid. It was very moist. There were puddles on the ground, but the water inside was black. There were protruding sharp stone awls like bamboo shoot. Dean walked forward for more than 10 meters when he suddenly heard a rustling sound. He stopped and listened attentively. This sound was the sound of scales rubbing against the ground. But the sound was dense and numerous. He tried his best to look forward. Very quickly, a shocking scene appeared at the end of his vision. He saw a black mass of desolate worms surging out from the cave in front of him. They were like a school of fish in the water. There were many black backs, but looking closely, they were pitch black and thick desolate worms. Every one of them was the size of the huge desolate worms he had encountered before. There were even a few extremely large desolate worms that were 4 to 5 meters long. Dean's scalp tingled. He had encountered swarms of worms outside the tunnel. Because of Amelie's physique, he had encountered them several times. But those worms were small and medium-sized. Even if they were in groups, he could easily deal with them. But the wild worms in front of him were different. They were comparable to the existence of pioneers. Moreover, he didn't know what other special abilities these worms had, such as super-strong corrosive liquid or spraying poisonous gas. Run! Dean turned around and pulled Amelie to run. Aisha followed closely behind him. Soon, Dean retreated to the narrow passage outside the cave. The giant worms that he had cut before seemed to have mastered the method of movement. They were wriggling and crawling towards him, but their speed was not fast. Dean used his sword to pick them up and rushed into the passage. He was thinking of a solution as he ran. The passage was full of cut wild worms. Some were still bouncing and twisting on the ground. Some were dead. But when Dean passed by, they immediately raised their bodies and stretched towards Dean's feet. "Ah!" Amelie screamed. Dean looked at her and saw a snow-white worm crawling on her leg and wrapping around her thigh. Dean frowned and slashed with his sword. Amelie was scared and screamed again. But the next moment, she felt that her leg was loosened. The snow-white worm was cut into 2 ends, but her snow-white thigh was not injured at all. She breathed a sigh of relief and felt frightened. She did not expect Dean's knife skills to be so accurate. Dean turned his head and looked behind him. He saw that the group of giant worms were still chasing him. They poured into the narrow passage. Dean's face turned ugly. Would these worms chase him all the way out of the Earth Dragon Cave? He was thinking when he saw a group of small and medium-sized worms coming from the passage in front of him. They were the worms that he had cut off before. He didn't expect that in less than half an hour they would recover their ability to move. 2 groups of worms were attacking from the front and the back. Dean's face was ugly. Although the worms in front were small and medium-sized, so he wasn't afraid of them. But there were many of them. It would take time to clean them up. But the huge worm swarm was imminent. He couldn't wait any longer. Amelie didn't know what was going on. But when she saw the anxious look on Dean's face, she was frightened. She knew that the thing she was most worried about had happened. At the same time, she heard the sound of the wall being hit. The sound was louder than the previous worm swarm. It sounded like countless wild beasts were approaching. She could almost imagine some horrible pictures in her mind. Could it be that she was going to be buried here with him? There was a trace of bitterness and fear in her heart. This was the purpose of her coming here. Even if she couldn't let Dean die with her, she could still severely injure Dean. The great priest had already prepared to capture the seriously injured Dean and interrogate him for his secrets and the coordinates of God's wall. Chapter 846. Dean frowned. The best way to escape was to rush out with Aisha and leave Amelie behind to attract the huge worms. But if the worms ate Amelie and returned to the nest, then he would have to face the worms again. If he couldn't deal with the worms, then he wouldn't be able to get the remains of the origami. The thought flashed through his mind. He suddenly grabbed one of Amelie's arms and used the clean edge of the saber's hilt to slice off a piece of flesh. He threw it at the huge worm swarm behind him. Amelia was still in a daze and was caught off guard. The pain from her arm made her scream, and tears almost fell from her eyes. She said angrily, "What are you doing?" Dean didn't answer. He took out a match from his waist and quickly lit it. He tore off Amelia's sleeves and exposed her snow-white arms. He lit the sleeves. Amelia's clothes were very thin. It was woven with animal wool. It was very warm and easy to ignite. The sleeves were ignited before the match was finished. Dean quickly tore off Amelie's other sleeve. He took out a small bottle from his backpack and threw it to her. "Apply it on the wound to stop the bleeding. Quick." Amelie took the bottle. She was annoyed and amused at the same time. But she had probably guessed the purpose of Dean's action. She opened the bottle and poured out dark red powder. She smeared it on the wound and frowned in pain. Dean ignited the other sleeve, and then threw the half-burnt sleeve to the front of the swarm of wild insects. The flame was erratic in the passage, reflecting the shadows on the wall like swaying ghosts, and then fell in the middle of the wild insects. The flame was still burning, but the wild insects quickly dispersed, not daring to get close to the flame. Dean was relieved. Although there were no records in the books, but since ancient times, fire was the nemesis of all life. Humans relied on fire to survive. Using fire to disperse beasts was the knowledge of ancient ancestors. Although the worms were special and had strong survival ability, they were obviously afraid of fire. After all, even microbes with strong survival ability would be destroyed by high temperature. If they weren't destroyed, then it could only mean that the temperature wasn't high enough. Amelie used the light from the fire to see the swarm of wild worms in the tunnel ahead. They were densely packed like snakes. Her scalp went numb and her face turned green. She even forgot the pain in her arm. Dean noticed that the huge worm swarm stopped and started to gnaw on the piece of flesh that he had thrown out. The worms swarmed forward and plunged into the center of the fight. They were like a group of black tentacles. He opened his backpack and took out 2 black stones. He rolled his burning sleeves towards the black stones. Amelie didn't understand Dean's behavior. "What are you doing? Take off your clothes," Dean ordered. Amelie was stunned. Her eyes widened as she said, What did you say?" Dean looked at her coldly. "If you don't want to be eaten by these things, then take off your clothes. I need burning materials." Amelie's face turned red. "Why don't you take off your clothes? You really won't take it off?" Dean was too lazy to explain the reason to her. He had a set of splitter armor, so it couldn't be burned. Only his underwear were flammable. But he naturally wouldn't take off his clothes until the last moment. Amelie had seen Dean's strength and domineering. She shivered in anger. She had never exposed her arms and thighs in front of a man before. She gritted her teeth. "If you want to kill me, then kill me. I'd rather die than be insulted by you." Quite chastity. Dean glanced at her. "I'll run out of fuel. If you don't take off your clothes, then I'll leave you here and let you be their dinner." Amelie raised her head to look at the passageway in front of her. Her sleeve was burning to the end and was about to be extinguished. From the light of the fire, she could see large numbers of wild worms circling around the flames and charging over. Her expression was ugly. She clenched her fists and did not make a sound. Dean didn't say anything more. He blew on the 2 black stones. The stones soon burned into a fiery red color. These were 2 pieces of coal. He carried them with him as fuel. They were also essential items in the wilderness. In most cases, the role of these 2 stones was more useful than first aid medicine. After all, first aid medicine couldn't cure all kinds of injuries, but fire was indispensable to human beings. Dean put the stone behind him after it was heated. Then he rushed to the front of the swarm of worms with his sword and quickly chopped them down. Whoosh! He activated his demon body, and the saber turned into a sticky liquid that covered his entire body. In the blink of an eye, he had turned into a monster with sharp blades all over his body. He stood in the tunnel like an evil god. Countless wild insects swarmed over. He waved the blades all over his body. In an instant, he was like the propeller of a helicopter. The grayish-white insects that swarmed 3 meters in front of him were quickly crushed into countless pieces. Amelie saw Dean's appearance through the flame. Although she couldn't see his face clearly, but the terrifying figure almost made her faint. Her heart was beating wildly. She didn't expect that the person she was accompanying was not a human but a monster. No wonder he was so indifferent. Boom! At this time, the giant worms in the passage rushed again. The piece of flesh that Amelie had thrown out had already been snatched. At this moment they were like a torrent. But when they were about to reach the 2 coal stones, their speed rapidly decreased. They stopped 3 meters away from the coal stones. They didn't dare to get close. Seeing this scene, Amelie's little heart slightly relaxed. She suddenly thought of an ancient legend. She didn't expect it to be true. These worms were extremely afraid of fire. To be precise, they were extremely afraid of high temperature. That's why the cave was so deep and cold. The giant worms stopped in front of the 2 coal stones. They didn't dare to get close. Some of the worms had round holes in front of them. Sharp blades came out of their mouth. They were like 2 praying mantis arms. They wriggled forward, but when they were about 2 meters away, they seemed to be burned and quickly shrank back. In fact, the temperature brought by the 2 coal stones was not high. But miraculously they blocked the giant worms that were comparable to pioneers. Dean was killing the worms in front of him while paying attention to the movements behind him. Seeing this scene, he was surprised. He thought that it would be good if he could slightly cushion the attacks of the giant worms. He didn't expect that they would all stop. How afraid of fire were they? He thought of Black Prison. It would explode at the slightest touch, and was also extremely afraid of fire. However, Black Prison was afraid of fire because its body was made of fat and oil. Moreover, Black Prison was an artificial product created by the Monster Research Institute. Could it be that the materials used to create Black Prison included this desolate worm? Chapter 847. Plop! Suddenly, a giant worm crawled to the top of the cave. The cave was about 4 meters high. The temperature of the coal shone on the top of the cave, giving the giant worm a chance to take advantage of it. Amelie screamed and retreated. Dean was scared by her scream. He turned around and his face changed. He quickly rushed to the front of the giant worm. His body was full of sharp blades. Puff! The giant worm was killed and cut into 7 or 8 pieces. Dean quickly returned to the front and blocked the worm's swarm. He shouted to Amelie, "Move a few stones from the side and pile them up. Put the coal on top and let the fire shine on the top." Amelie recovered, but there was still a trace of palpitation on her face. She quickly followed Dean's instructions and picked up a few stones from the side. But when she came to the front of the coal, she was in a dilemma. The coal was burning red. How could she take it to the top of the stone and pile it up? Dean paid attention to her movements. He could not help but roll his eyes. "Don't you know how to pull a piece of cloth to wrap them up and quickly bring them to the top of the stone? So stupid!" Amelie's face turned red. She tore off a piece of cloth. With her current strength, it was easy to tear the cloth. If it was before, she could only use her teeth to bite it. After tearing out a piece of cloth, she held both ends and pulled the coal to the top of the stone. At this time, the cloth was ignited by the coal. She saw that the worms were climbing up the rock wall. They wanted to find the weakest point to break in. She immediately threw the cloth towards the place where the worms were gathered. The flames danced and the giant bugs were in chaos. They screeched and shrank back. However, one of them could not retreat in time, and the burning cloth fell on its head. It immediately cried out in pain and thrashed around crazily. It smashed into the rock wall and created a few deep holes. Then it slowly slid down. Its body softened like it was melting ice. Especially on its head, which was covered by the burning cloth, the tissue actually fell down softly. Amelie did not expect that these terrible worms would be so easily injured. She was surprised and secretly excited. But soon she realized that fuel was a major problem. If there was enough fuel, she could kill these worms with her own strength. But in this damp cave, where would she get fuel? She looked at herself and blushed again. The coal was piled on top of the stone. The warm fire seemed to form an enchantment that blocked the cave. The fierce-looking worms were stagnant and did not dare to come close. A few minutes later, Dean had killed all the worms that were coming from the front passage. After several minutes of high-speed cutting, he had consumed a lot of physical strength. His whole body was sweating. After dealing with the worms in front of him, he sat on the ground and slowly untied his demonic body to restore his human appearance. He leaned against the rock wall with the demonic knife in his hand and gasped for breath. Amelie was relieved to see Dean return to his human form. Although she knew that Dean was not a human, but at least under his human appearance, she could still communicate with him. These worms seemed to be afraid of fire. Should we go out and find some fuel to deal with them? Amelie asked in a low voice. Dean glanced at her. It was naturally the best way to go out and find fuel. But he was afraid that if they went out, they would not have the opportunity to come back. The great priest had most likely set up an attack outside. Once they went out, they could only run away. He did not want to leave before he got the remains of the origami. He said, "If there is nothing to burn, then I will burn your clothes. If there is nothing to burn, then I will peel off your skin. Then I will fry the fat out of your skin and smear it on the stone." Amelie's heart was beating wildly. She shrank back. She imagined the scene of peeling off the skin. She felt the horror and pain. She gritted her teeth. "If you dare to do this, then I will die with you." Dean ignored her and looked at the giant worms gathered in front of the coal. He was surprised. The fear of fire was too strong for these giant worms. If it was 2 burning bonfires instead of 2 pieces of coal, they would be scared. He could understand, but just the temperature of the small coal was able to scare them. It was really inconceivable. Dean quietly watched and pondered. Suddenly he felt hungry. He took out some dry food from his backpack and ate it. Amelie saw Dean eat. She felt hungry too. She looked at Dean and wanted to ask for more food. But she thought about Dean's temperament. He might not give it to her. So she was too lazy to lose face. Dean looked at her and said, "Do you want to eat?" Amelie saw Dean take the initiative to ask. She was happy. She slightly raised her head and said, "Not bad." Dean grabbed something on the ground and threw it to her. "Eat." Amelie took it. She found that it was a wriggling worm. She was scared and almost threw it away. "This thing can improve your strength and fill your stomach. How good is it? Do you goddesses like to waste food?" Dean indifferently said. Amelie stared at him. She put the worm into a jar. She suddenly felt that her stomach was not so hungry. Time passed. After eating, Dean leaned against the rock wall to rest. After less than half an hour, he suddenly opened his eyes and looked at the ground in front of him that was full of worms. As he gazed at the ground, the rock wall next to the worms suddenly broke, and a few giant worms crawled out from inside. Dean's face changed. He turned around and saw that the number of giant worms in front of the coal stones had decreased. They had unexpectedly come to the other side of the cave. Amelie also noticed it. She was nervous. Dean quickly took out a piece of coal from his backpack. He took out a towel from his backpack and ignited it. He wrapped the burning towel around the coal stone and put it on the rock next to him. The giant worms that came from the other side of the passage stopped. Amelie was relieved. She heard Dean say, "It seems that we are surrounded. I told you to rush out to find fuel and then come back. You didn't believe me," Amelie said in a bad mood. Dean glanced at her. "Now there are only two ways. The first is to throw you out and lead the worms away. Then I will escape alone. The second is to wait here until the fuel is exhausted. Then I will throw you out and I will escape. Which one do you think is better?" "You." Amelie stared at him. Dean once again leaned against the rock wall and quietly pondered. He suddenly thought that these worms were very interested in the descendants of the Huang god. So it was reasonable to say that they were more interested in the remains of the Huang god. After all, the descendants of the Huang god had been passed down for many generations and the bloodline of the Huang god had become thin. Could it be that the remains of the Huang god in the depths of the cave had been eaten up? No, if that was the case, then why did these worms gather here? But if they were not eaten, why would they leave the remains of the origami and be attracted by him? Chapter 848. Creatures that live in groups must have a leader. Dean should have thought of this. The reason why these worms came out of the nest to attack him or Amelia should not be simple because of Amelia's smell. They should be under the command of the leader. This was the most reasonable explanation. However, he did not know what level the leader of the worm was. But as long as he killed it, the rest of the worms should be much easier to deal with. Dean stood up and looked at Amelia. "Find something and bring the coal. Get ready to go in with me." "Go in?" Amelia was surprised. "Are we going to go inside?" Dean indifferently glanced at her. "Whether you can keep up with me or not depends on your luck." If she couldn't keep up with Dean, she would become food for these worms. She quickly swept the ground to find something to wrap the burning coal, but there were only stones on the ground. She suddenly thought of the boots under her feet. She hesitated for a moment, but quickly took them off. Her snow-white feet stepped on the cold and wet ground. The sticky feeling made her feel nauseous, but she couldn't care so much at the moment. Dean didn't pay attention to Amelia anymore. He turned to look at Aisha. There was a trace of apology in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I have to make you do it again." Aisha was indifferent and silent. Dean took a deep breath. He raised his hand and shook the bell. At the same time, the knife in his hand turned into mucus and covered his whole body. He entered into the demonic body state. Roar! Aisha screamed as she heard the bell. Her bones made crackling sounds. Pure black scales spread out from her body. She also entered into the strongest demonic body state. In the blink of an eye, Dean and Aisha turned into two ferocious monsters, standing in the cave. Dean didn't stay any longer. He suddenly rushed into the depths of the cave, passing by the coal like a phantom. His sharp limbs danced in the air, cutting the surging giant worm into minced meat. He was like a huge meat grinder, pushing straight through the cave. Aisha tore up the giant worm that Dean had missed. Amelia saw the changes in Dean and Aisha. She was so scared that her face turned pale. She wanted to turn around and run away, but the huge worm was eyeing her covetously. She finally chose to follow behind Dean. Although she felt that Dean was a monster, but at least he could transform into a human and communicate with them. But the worm was a pure monster and there was no possibility of communication. The huge worm's body was covered with sharp thorns as it screamed and rushed toward Dean. If other magic marks warriors encountered such a situation, even if their strength was far superior to these wild worms, they would still be entangled and gradually fall. But Dean happened to be the splitter who specialized in group attack. His sharp blade-like limbs could cut through iron like mud. The toughness of the blade was harder than many legendary magic marks that were famous for their defense. Although other parts of his body were weak, Dean had long learned to use the blade-like limbs as his weapon of attack and defense. It was both a sharp blade and a shield. As the giant worm approached Dean, it was chopped into pieces. 7 or 8 blade-like limbs moved like a rotating meat grinder. Soon, the worm was pushed more than 10 meters away, leaving minced meat on the ground. Puff, puff. Dean continued to wave the blade-like limbs. As he continued to push forward, his body overflowed with a lot of sweat. His physical strength hadn't fully recovered from killing ordinary wild worms. At this moment, he was completely relying on the dragon blood technique to stimulate his heart and body. But the more he killed, the slower he felt. His invincible blade-like limbs seemed to be gradually dulled. More and more giant worms rushed out from the gap between Dean's blade-like limbs, but they were torn into pieces by Aisha, who followed closely behind. When a blade-like limb chopped a giant worm from the side, Dean suddenly felt different. He didn't directly cut the worm. When he looked at it, his pupils shrank. He saw that the edge of the blade-like limb was covered with ice crystals, as if it was frozen. The ice crystals caused the width of the blade to increase, but the sharpness was greatly reduced. Dean was shocked. What was the reason? He didn't have time to think or solve it. He could only continue to wave the ice-covered blade-like limb forward. But after the sharpness was reduced, he had to spend more strength to cut the giant worm. In addition to this blade, Dean found that the other blade-like limbs were the same. They were covered with ice crystals. He killed along the way and noticed that every time the blade-like limbs cut the body of the giant worm, the ice crystals would grow a little. After knowing the reason, Dean could only rush forward with more effort. After 4 or 5 minutes, Dean finally rushed out of the passage and returned to the previous spacious underground cave. He turned his head and looked back. The passage behind him was full of chopped giant worms and Amelia, who was running with her boots carrying coal stones. Amelia's hair and shoulders were still gently wriggling, but she had no time to care about them. Her face was pale as she stepped on the sticky ground full of minced meat. Dean glanced at Aisha. She was still maintaining the demonic form. She was silent like ice, but her body was full of demonic aura. No one dared to provoke her. Dean let out a sigh of relief and released his demon body. He was ready to take a break. This short journey had completely exhausted his physical strength. If the wild worm leader was a dominator level or even an abyss level, he would most likely be killed in seconds if he faced it in his current state. He could only stop and rest. Amelia was relieved to see that Dean had returned to his human form. She poured out the coal stones from her boot. But the leather boots had been burnt and could no longer be worn. She pulled out the minced meat from her body and hair. She came to the side and sat down to rest. She said to Dean, "You could have killed your way out long ago. Why did you run away?" Dean sat against the wall and closed his eyes to rest. He didn't pay attention to Amelia's words. Amelia saw that Dean ignored her again. She was angry but didn't dare to fight back like before. She was worried that Dean would attack her. Time passed slowly in the silence. After resting for a few hours, Dean took out dry food and water to eat. Amelia looked at him eagerly. But she knew that Dean wouldn't share it with her. She was too lazy to beg. Dean got up again and directly entered the demonic form after his physical strength was restored. Aisha also entered the attack state. He called out to Amelia and continued to walk into the depths of the cave. This time they walked for hundreds of meters but still didn't see a single worm. It was assumed that the worms here were the ones that took the initiative to attack. Chapter 849. Less than 30 meters in front of him was the end of the cave. There was no way forward, and on the rock wall at the end of the cave, there was a gigantic figure more than 10 meters tall. Its upper body was that of a human, with a perfect face, slender arms, and a voluptuous and seductive naked body. However, its lower body was that of a hideous spider or a scorpion with strange tissues. Aragami. Dean had seen her statue in the square in the village. Her appearance was exactly the same. But what really shocked Dean was that there was a huge snake-like worm wrapped around her body. It was not appropriate to use the word bug to describe it. After all, it was bigger than most wild beasts. However, its appearance was not much different from a desolate worm. The only difference was that it was bigger, and its entire body was as clear as crystal. Even in the dark and damp depths of the cave, where there was no sunlight, it still had a crystalline and gorgeous feeling. Origami's remains, worm. Dean thought that the remains of the origami had been completely eaten up. He didn't expect that it was still intact. There wasn't a trace of damage on it. It seemed that the origami had died of old age. The crystal worm that was wrapped around her body was a bit strange. Although Dean couldn't see the heat source, but he had an intuition that it was alive. Amelie was puzzled as she saw Dean stop. But she didn't dare to ask Dean who was in his demonic state. She just held the coal and stayed behind Dean. Time seemed to stand still. Dean took a deep look at the origami and the crystal worm that was wrapped around her body. He waved his sharp limbs and picked up a stone from the ground. He threw it towards the crystal worm that was wrapped around the origami's body. If the coal wasn't burned out, then Dudian would have thrown out the coal at the moment. Whoosh! The rock flew over, and in the next moment, the crystal desolate worm that was coiling around the desolate god's remains suddenly twisted and dodged the rock. The stone hit the origami's body and bounced off. It rolled on the ground and made a grumbling sound. It was particularly harsh in the cold and dark cave. Dean's eyes sank. He swung his blade-like limbs but didn't attack. Instead, he aimed at Amelie, who was behind him. Amelie felt cold and screamed the next moment. The clothes on her body were torn by Dean's sharp blade and hooked onto one of Dean's sharp blades. At this moment, her whole body was naked. Dean didn't take her clothes out of bad taste, but he didn't want to waste too much energy. Origami was afraid of fire, and this crystal worm was no exception. The crystal worm heard Amelie's scream and was stimulated. It swam out of the origami's remains and moved along the wall above her head. Dean saw it rushing towards him. His arm quickly returned to human form. He took out a match and ignited Emily's clothes. The fire started to burn. He hung the burning clothes on his blade and rushed towards the crystal worm. All of a sudden, the blazing fire lit up the entire cave. Amelia, who was completely naked and blushing, instantly saw the crystal wasteland worm that was rushing towards her from the top of the cave wall. She also saw the remains of the origami that was embedded in the wall in front of her. She was instantly stunned and stood there in a daze. The crystal wasteland worm was startled by Dudien's burning clothes, and its body suddenly stopped. The next moment, a burst of white mist sprayed out from the round hole in front of its body, and the temperature quickly dropped. When Dean was hit by the white mist, he suddenly felt cold and shivered. The chill in his right arm seemed to have revived, making the right half of his body a little numb. But what shocked him even more was that the burning clothes were quickly frozen when they were hit by the white mist. Yes, the flame was frozen. If he didn't see it with his own eyes, Dean wouldn't have imagined that such a thing would happen. How strong was the rapid freezing? In addition to the burning clothes that were frozen, the sharp knife that Dean used to pick up the clothes and several other sharp knives were also quickly frozen. Most of his body was covered with ice in the blink of an eye and turned into an ice sculpture. Plop! The inertia from rushing forward and the sudden freezing caused him to lose his balance and tumble forward. Fortunately, although his body was frozen, the frozen ice seemed to be extremely tough. When he tumbled to the ground, it did not shatter or break. Whoosh! The crystal worm on the wall quickly swam, but it didn't rush towards Dean. Instead, it rushed towards the naked Amelie, who was hugging her chest. Amelie saw this horrible scene through the dim light of the frozen flame. She was scared and screamed as she retreated. She accidentally stepped on a stone and fell to the ground. Her smooth buttocks hit the rough ground. It was very painful, but she couldn't feel it anymore. In her eyes, there was only the crystal worm that was quickly approaching. Roar! With a sudden roar like a demon from hell, full of killing intent, a black whip shadow suddenly lashed out. With a bang, the crystal desolate worm that was pouncing towards Amelie was whipped to the side, rolling 7 to 8 meters away. It was Aisha who made the move. Aisha's pure black eyes turned slightly. She glanced at Dean, who was half frozen, and took a deep breath. Her scale-covered throat bulged slightly, and a red light appeared. The next moment, a thick flame spurted out from her mouth and rolled toward Dean. Dean's frozen body quickly melted and thawed under the burning of the dragon's breath. His body quickly regained its freedom. The burning clothes on the blade started to burn again. He was surprised. He didn't know why Aisha knew to thaw him first instead of directly rushing towards the crystal worm. Was this a conscious performance? But why didn't she show it before? At this moment, the situation was urgent. Dean didn't continue to think about it. He quickly threw the burning clothes towards the crystal worm. The crystal worm crawled up from the ground and saw the flying flame. It growled and suddenly 2 sharp blades appeared under its body. It pried the stones on the ground and smashed the burning clothes on the other side of the rock wall. The attack failed. Dean's eyes were dignified. He quickly rushed towards it. But this time, he was more careful. He didn't dare to touch the strange white mist. This white mist was beyond his understanding. It could even freeze the flame. It was incredible! The crystal worm slightly shook its body. When Dean was less than 3 meters in front of it, it once again spurted out the white mist. Dean suddenly accelerated. The magic wings on his back flashed. His sharp blade was placed on the ground on the right side. He used all his strength to push his body to the left. This dodge was like teleportation. However, when he flashed to the left side, the crystal worm seemed to have calculated that he would appear here. Its body rushed straight towards him. It seemed that he took the initiative to hit the crystal worm. Bang! The crystal worm hit his chest. Dean suddenly felt like he was hit by a piece of extremely cold ice. His chest was in so much pain that he suffocated. His body flew out and hit the other side of the rock wall. Chapter 850. After the crystal desolate worm hit Dean, its body was slightly cushioned, and it once again rushed toward Dean. The round hole in the front split open, revealing a mouth full of sharp teeth. Like a snake, the mouth suddenly expanded several times and was able to swallow Dean whole. At this moment, a black shadow flashed. Dean felt his body was driven back. Aisha's demonized figure blocked in front of him, and her dragon tail slightly slapped the ground, confronting the crystal desolate worm. He was saved again. Dean looked at her in a daze. Did she wake up? Before he could think deeply, a chill suddenly spread from his chest to his whole body. He hurriedly looked down and saw the ice on the carapace on his chest spreading around. In addition to the surface of the carapace, he found that the flesh and blood under the carapace, including his heart, seemed to be frozen, and the blood in his body could not circulate. His whole body quickly became cold. He hurriedly used the dragon blood technique to stimulate his heart, but his heart did not seem to feel anything and did not move. In medicine, a person was likely to die if the heart stopped. But Dean's brain and consciousness were clear. Although his heart stopped, he did not faint. His face was ugly, and he immediately used the dragon blood technique to control the blood vessels in his body, so that the blood bypassed the heart and circulated back and forth in his limbs. This process was a bit difficult, and it was also his first time trying it. He also knew that it would not last long. Without the return of the heart, the oxygen in the blood would gradually lose, and it would become dead blood. At this time, Aisha and the crystal desolate worm were fighting together. Aisha's figure was like a young dragon. Her arms turned into dragon claws, and her whole body was covered with scales. The dragon wings on her back changed into 4, which was one more pair of wings than a normal dragon. She lay on the ground and roared. The sticky blood veins on her wings were slightly hot, and then she spat out a scorching dragon flame at the crystal desolate worm. The crystal desolate worm seemed to be aware that Aisha was far more difficult to deal with than Dean. The moment Aisha spat out the dragon flame, its round body quickly rolled to the side, and then it wriggled like a snake, spitting out a crystal-like icicle from its mouth. The icicle came extremely fast, but Aisha dodged faster. The 4 wings on her back fluttered, and her body twisted in the air to avoid the icicle. Bang! The icicle swept under her body and stabbed Dean's blade-like limbs, almost penetrating one of his blade-like limbs. The icicle emitted cold air, which made Dean's hair stand up. He quickly turned his body and fell to the other side to avoid being accidentally injured. After spitting out the icicles, the crystal wasteland worm quickly rushed towards Aisha. Its plump body suddenly protruded with sharp icicles like a hedgehog. Aisha roared and swung her tail angrily, and slapped on the crystal desolate worm's body. Bang! The crystal desolate worm fell to the ground and a deep pit. Aisha's dragon tail was covered in blood, but the blood had not yet flowed out. Aisha looked down and then looked up at the crystal desolate worm. She roared as if she was enraged and suddenly rushed down. The crystal desolate worm climbed up from the ground and saw Aisha falling from the sky. It was unwilling to show weakness, and opened the round hole on the top of its head, revealing the dense, sharp teeth inside. It expanded several times, as if it wanted to swallow Aisha in one bite. "No!" Dean hurriedly roared. Aisha's corpse nature was not afraid of death, and her attacks were rude. It would be difficult to escape death if she rushed like this. The next moment Aisha hit straight up, and her whole upper body rushed into the crystal desolate worm's mouth. The crystal desolate worm's body swelled up, and before the crystal desolate worm could close its mouth, the lower body of the crystal desolate worm burst open, and flames flashed. Dean was dumbfounded. Aisha's body slowly stood up from the ground, and shook her upper body to shake off the half of the crystal desolate worm. Her chest, neck, hair, cheeks, and other parts of her upper body were full of wounds, and were dripping with blood. In the short process of being swallowed, she was almost chewed to pieces. Her face was indifferent, without any emotion. Her pure black eyes looked at the half of the crystal desolate worm that was thrown away. She screamed, and suddenly opened her mouth. Her whole face was flushed with blood, and a vigorous dragon flame was sprayed out again, hitting the half of the crystal desolate worm that was twisting on the ground. The flame bathed the crystal desolate worm, and an ear-piercing scream sounded. The flame was extinguished in the blink of an eye, but the body of the crystal desolate worm that was burned by the flame quickly softened, like a pool of viscous liquid. Seeing that the crystal desolate worm was defeated, Dean was relieved, and then felt a burst of dizziness in his brain. He tilted his head and fainted. Dean didn't know how much time had passed, but he woke up in the darkness. The moment his consciousness recovered, he suddenly opened his eyes, jumped up from the ground, and soon saw the surrounding scene clearly. It was still the dark cave, and the remains of the origami were embedded in the rock wall in front of him. The perfect cheeks quietly looked down at him, as if it was alive, with an indescribable evil looking at him. Dean quickly looked around, and saw Aisha sitting on the rock wall not far behind him, leaning against the rock wall with her eyes closed. It seemed that she was sleeping, and she had touched the demonic body. Dean was relieved to see that she was fine, and then he saw Amelie, who was curled up on the other side of the rock wall. Her hands were holding her knees, and her head was shrinking, and she was secretly looking at him. Seeing that she was fine, Dean was too lazy to care about her. His eyes fell on the place where the crystal desolate worm had fallen, and saw that the crystal desolate worm was still lying there, but its body had melted into a pool of white mucus, like mercury, motionless on the ground. It was the first time for Dean to see such a strange creature, so he didn't dare to approach it. At this time, he suddenly thought of his frozen chest, and looked down to find that his demonic body had touched it when he was in a coma. The temperature of his chest was normal, and there was no trace of coldness, and his heart had resumed beating. Did she do it? Dean looked at Aisha, and thought of all her previous actions, and his heart suddenly became hot. It was a conscious performance. Did it mean that she had recovered some of her consciousness? He went to her side and squatted down. His eyes were slightly moist, and he whispered, "Can you hear me?" Aisha opened her eyes and looked at him. There was no trace of emotion in her pure black eyes. "Can't you speak? If you can hear me, then blink." Dean's voice was slightly trembling, and his heart was extremely nervous. Aisha quietly looked at him, as if she didn't hear anything. Dean's tight heart suddenly felt like it was pricked, and at the same time, there was a kind of feeling of discouragement, but he didn't want to give up so easily, and continued. "I know that you are conscious, but why don't you respond to me? Do whatever you want and respond to me, okay? I beg you. Can you respond to me?" Dean's face was full of eagerness, almost begging. Aisha looked at him, but didn't speak and didn't respond. Chapter 851. He didn't give up and continued to persuade her. 10 minutes passed, but Aisha didn't respond. Dean turned around and looked at Amelie, who was sitting on the other side. "What happened after I was in a coma?" Amelie seemed to expect Dean's question. "She was lying on your chest after you fainted. I don't know what she was doing, but she seemed to be kissing you. Then she touched the demonic body and sat there for a long time until you woke up." "She was lying on my chest?" Dean was shocked. She was the one who unfroze his chest. It showed that she was conscious. He couldn't help but look at her. His mood was a bit complicated. Since she was conscious, why didn't she respond to him? Dean calmed down after a long time. He asked Amelie, "How long was I in a coma?" "I don't know." "How long?" "About 7 or 8 hours. Dean frowned as he looked at the slime not far away. He slowly got up and walked towards it. Amelie's eyes lit up as she looked at him. Dean heard movement from behind as he was about to reach the slime. He turned around and saw Aisha sitting in a straight posture. Dean was puzzled. He didn't give her any instructions, so why would she adjust her sitting posture? He didn't think much about it as he continued to walk towards the slime. He wanted to see what was the use of the slime. At this time, another sound came from behind. Dean looked and saw Aisha stand up from the ground. Dean was startled as he came to her. "Do you want to say something to me? Can you hear me?" Aisha quietly looked at him but didn't speak. Dean repeatedly asked several times but found that she had returned to her silent state. His heart was somewhat discouraged. After repeated attempts, there was still no response. He sighed and turned to continue to walk towards the silver mucus. Just as he was about to walk closer, he heard footsteps behind him. Dean looked at Aisha and saw her taking a few steps towards him. Dean looked at her in puzzlement. He glanced at Amelie. "Is this the body of the insect?" Amelia's heart skipped a beat as she heard Dean's question. Dean narrowed his eyes. "Really? The previous worm was too big for you to swallow. This time it has melted. Come and have a taste." Amelie's expression changed. She pouted and said, "What taste? Do you think it's some delicacy? I don't want to eat it." "I told you to come." Dean narrowed his eyes. "Unless you want to eat the bugs outside." Amelie said stubbornly, "I'm not going." Dean looked at her, looked at the pool of silver water in front of him, and slowly retreated a few steps. He said without looking back, "This thing should not be dead yet, but I am very curious about how it attacks people now. You go over and let me see." Amelie's face changed. "What are you talking about? This thing is dead. I don't want to get close to such a disgusting thing." Dean came in front of her. "Either you go over by yourself or I will throw you over. You choose one." Amelie trembled in anger as she saw Dean's serious expression. She clenched her fists and glared at Aisha. "Yes, it's not dead. It can still move. Are you satisfied now?" Dean indifferently said, "Tell me, how did you know? How did it attack?" Amelie gritted her teeth. "I was going to get close to take a look, but it stretched out a tentacle and almost caught me." Dean glanced at her but didn't say anything. He didn't do anything to her because of her deliberate concealment of the matter. He turned to Aisha, who was sitting on the ground. Dean looked at her unchanging expression, but there was a bit of pain and a bit of excitement in his heart. Obviously, her previous actions were to remind him. This once again proved that she was conscious, and this consciousness was to protect him. But he didn't know why he couldn't get a response when he tried to communicate with her. It was difficult for him to understand, but this situation finally let him see a glimmer of hope. "You saved me again. You always save me." Dean held her hand and said softly. Aisha was silent. Dean whispered softly, telling the feelings that had been suppressed in his heart for a long time. As he spoke, he suddenly saw that her clothes were damaged on her back. He was shocked and immediately stretched out his head to take a look. His heart suddenly became cold, and then it was incomparably painful. He saw that Aisha's back was badly mutilated. Her spine was in the middle of her snow-white skin. It was as if a layer of skin had been rubbed off from the ground. At the same time he found that her soles, heels and other places were full of scars. Was it caused by the previous battle? Dean thought about the time when she killed the crystal worm. Her upper body was bitten by the crystal worm. Most of the scars were caused at that time. After a while, he woke up and wanted to slap himself. He quickly turned over his backpack and took out the hemostatic medicine and healing medicine. He carefully bandaged Aisha's wound. 10 minutes later, Dean had bandaged all the wounds on her body. He felt cold and hungry. He took out the remaining dry food from his backpack and ate it. He ate a lot and ate the rest of the dry food. The previous continuous battle and the coma had consumed a lot of his physical strength. The cold energy in his right arm showed signs of recovery. He could only eat as much as possible to increase the decomposition in his body. Aisha saw that Dean was eating sweetly. She couldn't help but grit her teeth. She was also hungry. But every time she thought about the appearance of the worm, she would lose her appetite. Even though she was hungry, she didn't have the appetite to swallow the disgusting thing. "Now that you have seen the origami, should we go out?" Aisha blinked her watery eyes and looked at Dean with pleading eyes. "We will naturally go out when we are healed." Dean glanced at her. "If I'm not wrong, the great priest should have made several arrangements outside. I'm going to find some worms. If she doesn't eat them, then you will have to cut your flesh." Aisha's face changed. You want to eat me?" Chapter 852. Dean came to the passage outside the cave. He picked a few sturdy giant worms and strung them with a knife. These giant worms were still gently struggling. They hadn't died yet. Their vitality was tenacious. Dean wiped them clean and sliced them. Each slice was as thin as a piece of bacon. He handed it to Aisha. Amelie, who was sitting on the opposite side, watched this scene nervously until Aisha opened her red lips slightly and put the piece of wild worm meat in her mouth. She chewed and swallowed it, and then heaved a sigh of relief. If she didn't eat the worm, it would eat her. Dean stopped after feeding her a piece. He carefully watched her changes. After all, being willing to eat and being able to eat were two different things. Aisha didn't have the bloodline of the origami. It was hard to guarantee that nothing would happen to her. After a few hours of observation, Aisha was still sitting quietly without any reaction. Dean touched her hands and feet. Her temperature didn't change. He couldn't help but wonder if the amount wasn't enough. He fed her a few more pieces. At this time, he also felt hungry. He rummaged through the backpack. The dry food inside had been eaten up. There were only 2 bottles of high-purity water left. He could only drink a few mouthfuls of water to alleviate his hunger. He glanced at Amelie. Amelie's body trembled. She felt like a little sheep being bitten by a viper. She would be entangled and swallowed at any time. Her heart was sad. Was she going to become Dean's food? Was there any meaning to his sacrifice? She curled up and bent her head down and brooded sorrowfully. Dean didn't know day and night in the dark cave. After a few hours, Dean saw that Aisha still didn't have any reaction. His heart was relieved for the time being. At least the worm wouldn't have any adverse effect on her. As for strengthening her physique, Dean didn't dare to ask for extravagant hope. As long as it could help her recover from her injuries as soon as possible. After all, it was inevitable that there would be a bitter fight when they left the Earth Dragon Cave. He wasn't afraid of the great priest's own strength, but he was afraid that she would use some high-tech weapons such as laser guns. His eyes flashed a trace of coldness as he thought of this. When I leave, should I take you with me or leave you here? Dean rested next to Aisha while talking to Amelie. Hearing this, Amelie's body trembled slightly. Without raising her head, she said in a low voice, "If you don't bring me out, you won't be able to leave. So you're willing to be my hostage?" "I'm just reminding you out of goodwill," Amelie said calmly, holding back her anger. "So you know what they'll do to me outside?" Dean looked at her. "Do you think it's a good idea to use you as a hostage? Look at you. You are so young and haven't seen the outside world. Will your people remember your contributions once they migrate to the God's Wall?" Amelie's expression changed slightly. She raised her head and glared at him angrily. "Don't talk nonsense." "Nonsense," Dean indifferently said. "I don't think so. Do you think that I'll deceive you? In fact, from the start, I wanted to tell you the location of the Divine Wall so that you could move there. Unfortunately, you didn't believe me, and things have escalated to this point. Don't question why I'm being so kind. In fact, strictly speaking, I'm not being kind. It's just that, as a person of the Divine Wall, I don't think that outsiders invading my homeland is a kind of invasion. Therefore, I welcome you all to come. After all, there is strength in numbers, right? If you migrate to the Wall, it will only promote the prosperity and development of the Wall. So why wouldn't I be happy? Unfortunately, you've been here for a long time. The local resources are scarce, so you think that other places are the same. I'm sorry to tell you that the Wall can feed tens of millions of people. It's self-sufficient, so you don't have to worry about resources. As long as you are diligent, you will have food," Dean said confidently. Amelie was in a trance. She knew some of the situation inside the Wall from the secrets of the clan. Dean's words not only included what she knew but also the environment inside the Wall. She slowly recovered and looked at Dean. "Why didn't you say so earlier?" "I've said it from the beginning, but trust is mutual." "I don't believe you. You don't have the conditions and are so barren and desolate. But you still don't believe me. To be honest, what is there to conspire about? Even if there is, isn't it worth it to use your things in exchange for the future of the clan? Unfortunately, you followed a foolish leader." Dudian shrugged. Amelie's face slightly changed. "Don't say bad things about the great priest." Dean glanced at her. "Although I don't know how she will deal with me. Maybe she will kill me together with you so that I won't return to the Wall and bring more people to attack you. But her worries are unnecessary. Because of this, she will put you in vain. In any case, I will tell her the coordinates of the Wall. I hope she won't be so stubborn." Amelie's eyes flickered. Dean saw that her mind was stirred. He knew that his goal had been achieved. He didn't say much but looked around. There was nothing here except for the remains of the origami. There was no excrement produced by the worms. It made him feel strange. Did they only eat and didn't vomit? Soon he thought of another thing. "Didn't you know that these worms are so afraid of fire?" Amelie frowned as she heard the trace of contempt in Dean's tone. "Of course we know. More than 200 years ago our villagers came here with torches and torches. They used the flames to kill the worms. But later the appearance of the flames alarmed the monster in the deepest part of the cave. That monster is the crystal worm we just met. It killed all the people who entered the cave. Later on, no one dared to light a fire after entering the cave. There were several times when someone accidentally lit a fire. It alarmed the worm and brought more trouble. So we made a rule that no one is allowed to bring a fire when entering the cave." Dean suddenly realized that the flames would alarm the crystal worm. No wonder they didn't use fire to attack, even though they knew that there was such a big weakness. Indeed, with the strength of the villagers, even if they brought torches they would be dead if they encountered the worm. The scene of the crystal worm freezing the flames was still fresh in his mind. This scene violated the scientific concept in his heart. It was incredible that the flames were frozen, but when his chest was frozen, he felt a trace of strangeness. Although the temperature of the white gas was extremely low, but it couldn't freeze the flames. It was like a sticky net that wrapped the flames. He didn't know how to describe it. It was an attack that he had never seen before. It seemed to be freezing, but it wasn't. He even suspected that the crystal worm wasn't a creature from the earth. It was one of the monsters that appeared during the doomsday. Dean pondered for a long time but still couldn't find the answer. After a long time, Dean thought of another thing and asked Amelie, "Did you put the remains of the origami here?" Amelie looked at the huge remains of the origami and shook her head. "Our ancestors put it here. Unfortunately, the worms invaded and occupied this place, so we couldn't enter." "Where did these worms come from?" "I don't know. They suddenly appeared one day." "Suddenly appeared?" Dean frowned. He felt that there were many doubtful points in her word. He asked again, "You are the offspring of the origami. Since the worm likes your blood, then it should also like the corpse of the origami. So why is it still intact?" Amelie looked at him and said, "The origami is the supreme god. After death, no worm can invade them." "What's so strange about that?" Dean was speechless. Was she trying to use myths to explain the science? Since he couldn't get an answer from Amelie, he didn't bother to ask any more. With Amelie's age, she probably didn't know much. All the secrets should be hidden in the old woman's mind. Unfortunately, he couldn't pry her mouth open. Suddenly, he thought of something and asked, "How would you migrate to the wall if I told you the coordinates of the wall?" "It's far away. Even if I came alone, I almost died several times. There are so many of you. What's the difference between you and the fireflies in the wild? Wouldn't you die faster if you go out?" Amelie knew that Dean was trying to get information from her. She lowered her head and ignored him. Dean saw that she didn't say anything, so his eyes turned. "Do you have something that can safely send all of you to a faraway place? Shouldn't it be a large object? Don't tell me it's the thing above your village?" Amelie was shocked. She didn't expect Dean to guess it. Dean's eyes lit up as he saw her trembling body. He didn't think that he would guess it right. The village was illuminated by lights which indicated that there was an energy source. From the size and breadth of the light inlaid, Dean had long suspected that there was a large aircraft above the village. From the remains of the origami, it could be inferred that the aircraft wasn't made by the Earth. It could be the spaceship of the aliens that invaded the Earth. If that was the case, then Amelie obviously had the authority to control the spaceship. "It seems that the harvest is bigger than I imagined." Dean's eyes lit up. The value of an alien aircraft was much higher than the remains of the origami. Moreover, the aircraft had energy. Chapter 853. Amelie's face was pale. This was the deepest secret of their clan. She didn't expect that it would not only attract Dean's attention but also be speculated by him. Although she felt that she could also deduce these things, but she wasn't as confident as Dean. It was as if he was sure that her deduction was the truth. She felt disgusted and frustrated. She bowed her head. "You can think whatever you want." She had made up her mind to not be tricked by Dean. Dean glanced at her and turned to look at the origami that was embedded in the stone wall. His eyes flashed as he couldn't figure out why the origami's body was here. If Amelie's ancestors buried the origami here, then why did they let the worms invade the cave? Moreover, the exit of the cave extended to the village and didn't come from the outside world. This point was very intriguing. At this time, his stomach growled again. Dean frowned as hunger burned his stomach. He looked at Aisha, who was next to him. He saw that her injuries hadn't worked. The drugs he used didn't work on her body. She could only rely on herself to recover. According to his understanding of the undead, the fastest way to recover from physical injuries is to eat. Although the undead can starve for a long time, their physique will not grow when they are starving. Instead, they will slow down because of lack of water. Even if it is an unconscious undead, it cannot even be called a creature. But even if it is an object, it has its own internal circulation and need. Moreover, according to the notes in the Monster Lab, the way of digestion of the walking dead was completely different from that of humans and other creatures. Some of the walking dead's internal organs were broken or even missing, but they could still be digested. The reason was that their digestive organs were not individual like the stomach, but similar to reptiles like snakes or some insects. The whole feeding passage was their digestive organs, including the throat. This was also the reason why the roar of undeads was so hoarse. The reason was that the vocal cords had already melted into a part of the digestive organs. Dean quietly looked at her. He felt that this time was exceptionally quiet and even a trace of sweetness. No matter how dangerous the environment was, as long as she was by his side, he felt that spring was always in bloom. He calculated the speed of Aisha's digestion and absorption. From time to time, he would cut a piece of worm and feed it to her mouth. Time passed. On the other side, Amelie couldn't bear the hunger any longer. Her stomach acid seemed to be digesting her body. She felt that she would be dissolved by the acid. Especially the sound of Aisha chewing made her want to grab a few stones and stuff them into her stomach. She suddenly felt that the barren worm wasn't that bad to eat. At least when Aisha ate it, she didn't feel anything strange. It was as if she was eating ordinary meat. Thinking of this, she licked her dry lips and said to Dean, Can you give me a piece?" Dean glanced at her. "Find it yourself." Amelie had expected that Dean wouldn't be so kind. She was about to get up when she suddenly thought of something. Her cheeks suddenly turned red. At the moment she was naked. If she didn't curl up on the ground and use her calves to cover her body, then she would inevitably expose her body to Dean. Thinking of this, she lowered her head in anger and didn't say a word. After a long time, hunger invaded her again. She slowly thought that since Dean had seen her body, it didn't matter if he saw her again. Thinking of this, she trembled and stood up. She leaned against the wall and slowly walked out of the cave while covering her chest with her hand. She didn't want to sit with Dean. Dean opened half of his eyes and glanced at the direction where she left. He tracked her movement through the heat source. He saw that she went to the passage, paused for a moment and then returned. He didn't look at her anymore. A few days passed. Aisha had eaten all the fat barren worms that Dean had previously retrieved. Dean was relieved that there was no sign of freezing even after eating such a large number of barren worms. After a few days of recovery, there was still a small part of her injuries that hadn't healed yet. Dean was a bit surprised. Aisha's physique could heal quickly even if her wrist was broken. But there were still bloodstains on her back and legs, as if they had just been cut open. Dean got up as he saw that the barren worms were finished. He felt his stomach growling again. He hadn't eaten for a few days, so he was cold and hungry. There were several times he even wanted to eat Amelie, but in the end he held back. He had killed many people, but it was the first time that he ate a human. Unless it was a last resort, he didn't intend to take this step as it would mean failure. Around the rock wall, Dean saw Amelie curled up on the other side of the rock wall. There were a few barren worms around her. She was unconscious and didn't alert. Dean went straight to the passage and was surprised to see the scene. He saw that most of the barren worms that had been cut off were gone. There was only a small pile of barren worms on the ground, but they were lying listlessly and didn't move. Strange. Dean slightly frowned. He had noticed that Amelie couldn't eat so many barren worms even if she had a big appetite. Could it be that the barren worms that weren't dead wriggled and escaped? It seemed that there was only one possibility left. He looked at the darkness in front of the passage and dispelled the idea of chasing. He went forward and picked up a few slightly fat barren worms. He found that one of them was nearly 2 meters long. It was almost as big as the previous barren worm. However, this barren worm was also lying on the ground weakly. When it saw Dean approaching, it quickly raised its head and rushed towards Dean. Dean waved his sword and cut the barren worm into several pieces. He brought it back but felt strange in his heart. It seemed that he didn't miss such a big barren worm along the way. He brought the barren worm back to Aisha's side and cut it into small pieces with his sword. He found that there were several scars on the barren worm's body. It looked like the folds of the front part of the earthworm. He hadn't seen this kind of injury on the barren worms before. He frowned but didn't think much about it. He cut a few pieces for Aisha to eat. His stomach growled again. He couldn't bear the hunger anymore. He turned his head and looked at Amelie, who was sitting on the other side of the rock wall. His eyes flashed with killing intent. After a moment, the killing intent slowly subsided. At this time, he suddenly remembered that there were several pieces of Sylvia's body in his backpack. Chapter 854. The idea took root in his mind and grew rapidly. There were 2 main reasons why Dean carried Sylvia's body. The first reason was that he could use the goddess's body to suppress and disperse the terrifying existences in the abyss. The second reason was that he could use the technology to study the goddess's body if he encountered other giant wall along the way. But now in this predicament, the body of Sylvia seemed to only have the most primitive function, which was to satisfy his hunger. Dean was still hesitant. But when the hunger hit his stomach again, Dean quickly cut off his worries. He got up and went around the dark silver mucus. He came to the body of origami that was embedded in the rock wall. He looked up at the face that was covered with dust, but the outline of the cheeks was still perfect. There was a special feeling in his heart. It seemed that she wasn't dead, but just temporarily sleeping and would wake up at any time. He knew that this feeling was probably because of the dangerous aura emitted from the body of the origami. Even though she was dead, the feeling of danger could still be felt. It showed how terrifying the power of the origami was when she was alive. Dean raised the sword and cut the strange leg of her lower body. The invincible sword was like cutting a hard piece of wood. It only cut a small part of the leg and then it got stuck inside. He sawed back and forth before he pulled back the sword and cut again along the previous cut. The hardness of this origami's body was almost the same as Sylvia's. He was glad that his magic mark was the splitter. If it was a legendary magic mark like the demonic dragon or the shadow hunter, he would be helpless and helpless. The strange leg of the body of the origami didn't bleed. It was the same as Sylvia's. The blood in their body seemed to be solidified in the body's cells. Moreover, there seemed to be no blood vessels in their body. The blood existed in every part of the body and didn't seem to need to enter the heart for circulation. After a few minutes, Dean cut off a piece of flesh that was as long as an arm. It was equivalent to the whole body of the origami, but it was only a very small wound. The color is the same as Sylvia's. Dean held the piece of flesh and returned to Aisha. At this time, Aisha seemed to feel something. She slightly tilted her head and looked at Dean. Her eyes fell on the piece of flesh in Dean's hand. Dean was surprised to see her reaction to the flesh of the origami. He asked, "Do you want to eat it?" Aisha didn't respond and just stared at him. Dean thought for a moment and decided to let her have a taste. But he had to see if there was any problem with the flesh and blood of the origami. Sylvia's body was frozen in the metal cabin. That was why it could be stored for 300 years. However, this origami was only buried in this cold underground cave. Although the temperature here was close to 0 degrees, it was still a far cry from the temperature of Sylvia's freezer. Although it did not appear to be rotten from the outside, it was hard to guarantee that the meat inside would not deteriorate and grow some horrifying bacteria. Dean took out the pieces of Sylvia's body from his backpack and compared them. He checked them repeatedly. After half an hour, he was surprised to find that the flesh of the origami was no different from Sylvia's body. The only difference was that the surface was slightly dirty. However, the color, smell, hardness and so on of the flesh were the same. This result shocked him. Could it be that the corpses of the War God clan wouldn't decay? Sylvia's body was hidden in the metal freezer. Was it not for preservation? Or the origami had just died not long ago? Dean dispelled the last thought as soon as it appeared. The abyssal survivors here had existed for a long time. If the origami had just died not long ago, then she could easily plunder a wall to shelter the residents here. He thought for a moment and finally gave up thinking about it. There were too many secrets. If he could get the top secret information of the Holy Kingdom, he might be able to know everything. However, with his current strength, it was obvious that he couldn't get in touch with these things. He used the sword to cut a piece of the origami's flesh. He got up and went around the corner. He came in front of Amelie, who was next to the rock wall. He asked, "Are you hungry?" Amelie was sleepy. She looked up at Dean when she heard his voice. The confusion in her eyes disappeared when she saw Dean. She was alert as she looked at the piece of meat that Dean handed to her. "What is this? Can't you recognize the meat?" "I'm asking, what is this meat?" Amelie held back her anger and said, "Meat that can fill one's stomach." Dean frowned and impatiently said, "I told you to eat it. Do I need to poison you if I want to kill you?" Amelie slightly gritted her teeth. She knew that Dean was telling the truth, but Dean's attitude made her feel very humiliated. However, she had seen Dean's tough means before. She could only say that a good woman wouldn't eat a loss so tough. Amelie put the piece of meat in her mouth and chewed. However, she found that she couldn't chew it. She could only swallow it. Dean used his X-ray vision to see the meat slipping down her throat. He turned to leave, but his eyes were always focused on her body. It was as if he was a precise instrument. He scanned her body, including the local heat source, heartbeat frequency, and so on. Time passed. 2 or 3 hours passed. Amelie suddenly had a reaction. She was holding her stomach and curled up into a ball. Her face was full of pain. Dean thought of her reaction when she ate the worm for the first time. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be that eating the flesh of the origami could strengthen her body? Dean found out that Amelie didn't hold back this time but cried out in pain. After a while, Dean saw her crawling on the ground. Her knees were bent, and then there was an embarrassing scene: diarrhea. Dean saw that the undigested flesh of the origami was mixed in with the things that she had pulled out when she was having diarrhea. Indigestion. Dean slightly raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect this result. Amelie's physique was equivalent to that of a senior hunter. Her digestive ability was several times that of an ordinary person. But she couldn't digest the flesh of the origami. Was this the secret of the origami's body not rotting? Amelie seemed to be free after the diarrhea. But soon she noticed the dirty thing behind her. She suddenly blushed. She peeked at Dean's side. She couldn't see him through the rock wall. She didn't know whether Dean noticed or smelled the smell of the dirty thing. But she felt that it shouldn't escape Dean's nose. She gritted her teeth. She picked up the worm on the ground and moved to the other side. Her heart was still full of shame. Chapter 855. After confirming that the origami's flesh was not poisonous, Dean couldn't wait to eat the whole piece of origami's flesh. However, his reason restrained the impulse. He cut a small piece of flesh and tasted it in his mouth. It was a bit fishy. He tried to chew it slowly. The flesh was extremely tough, but he was a dominator after all. His bite force was far stronger than Amelia's. After chewing for a few minutes, he chewed the flesh and slowly swallowed a part of it. The feeling of hunger was alleviated a lot when the flesh entered his stomach. He leaned against the rock wall and quietly cultivated. A few hours passed. Dean didn't feel any discomfort. The suppressed hunger in his stomach attacked again. He cut a small piece of flesh and ate it. Then he continued to rest to save physical strength. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. During this period, whenever Dean was hungry, he would eat a small piece of Aragami's flesh to alleviate the hunger. Although he ate several pieces of flesh, his body didn't feel any discomfort or other reaction. However, it was after all hundreds of years of flesh from an unknown Aragami. He didn't dare to eat too much. He just wanted to ensure that he could survive this predicament. Aisha's injuries were slowly recovering. Dean estimated that she would be completely healed in 2 or 3 days. Amelia stayed on the other side. She seemed to have slowly adapted to the taste of the worm. She went out to forage for food and ate more and more. Her physique was getting stronger and stronger. In just a few days, she had reached the level of senior limitless. It was faster than using God's marrows. Dean was envious and regretful at the same time. If he could also eat worm to strengthen his physique, he would have reached the abyss level by now. He might even be stronger than the abyss walkers. The cave was filled with the stench of blood and Amelia's feces. Dean was used to it. Amelia didn't feel embarrassed anymore. After all, the most embarrassing scene was seen by Dean. She seemed to have grown a lot in just a few days. She no longer cared about Dean's attitude and was not easily angered by him. In this pitch-black cave, the 3 of them stayed inside, allowing time to pass. Dean couldn't bear the hunger. He skillfully took out his sword and cut a piece of Aragami's flesh and threw it into his mouth. He slowly chewed and swallowed it. Half an hour later, Dean suddenly felt hot and sweaty all over his body. He opened his eyes in surprise and looked down at his body with his X-ray vision. Staying in this cold cave for a few days, the chill in his right arm was restless from time to time. But at this moment, the chill in his right arm seemed to have disappeared, and he didn't feel cold at all. It was like returning to the state before he was infected with the ice blood disease. He looked at his chest and abdomen. Under the epidermis there were complicated veins, meridians, and bones. The first thing he did was to look at his organs. Other than stomach acid and undigested Aragami meat, there was nothing else. He let out a sigh of relief. However, the next moment, his expression changed. He stood up abruptly and took off his armor. Then he touched his back with his hand. His movements were very fast, and he immediately felt a protruding sarcoma on his back. He was shocked. At first, he thought that it was a worm that crawled into his armor. He didn't expect that the crawling feeling came from the protruding thing under his skin. When his fingers touched the protruding sarcoma, the sarcoma seemed to have a life of its own as it quickly crawled toward the back of his neck. That wriggling feeling was like a naked worm galloping on his back. Dean's face changed. He twisted his palm and pressed the sarcoma, blocking its way. But when he pressed the sarcoma, it suddenly sank and shrank into the depths of his skin. The sudden appearance of the sarcoma made Dean panic. Even though he was always calm, he was scared by this strange situation. The most important thing was that he smelled the smell of danger and death. After the sarcoma disappeared, he did not dare to stop and wait for it to bulge again. He immediately squatted down and leaned the armor that he had taken off against the rock wall behind him. The breastplate in the center of the armor could reflect light, and his field of vision was 270 degrees. Tilting his head slightly, he could see the situation on his back through the breastplate. Through his X-ray vision, he soon saw that there was a sarcoma the size of a baby's fist next to his spine. The sarcoma's color was extremely strange. It was gold, like liquid metal. He was very clear about his body's condition. This golden sarcoma had never appeared before. Was it caused by eating the Aragami's flesh? He could only think of this possibility. His face suddenly became very bad. He had gradually relaxed after eating the Aragami's flesh for the past few days. But he didn't expect such a sudden change. "I have to dig this thing out." Dean didn't dare to let this thing continue to stay in his body, especially the feeling of this thing moving so fast just now. It made him feel horrified. He immediately took out the dagger on his leg and stabbed it backhand. Puff! His speed was very fast. The dagger pierced straight through the skin. But the moment the skin was pressed, the golden sarcoma seemed to feel the danger. It quickly slid forward and then slid straight up along the spine to the back of his neck. Dean's face changed. He immediately pinched the back of his neck and pressed hard so that the flesh on the back of his neck was firmly attached to the cervical vertebrae. In this position, his arm was twisted in the opposite direction, almost breaking. It looked extremely terrifying. The golden sarcoma rushed to the front of the back of his neck. It seemed to feel that there was no way forward. It suddenly turned around to the front of Dean's throat and continued to rush up. Above, it was the head. It was going to enter his brain. This was an extremely terrifying feeling. Dean almost didn't think about it. He waved the dagger to cut his throat. This time, he used almost the fastest speed. Puff! The dagger cut through the throat, the artery was cut, and the larynx was also ruptured. The next moment, his fingers were like hooks, reaching into the throat to grab the golden sarcoma. This series of movements was as fast as lightning, but the reaction of the golden sarcoma was faster than Dean had imagined. At the same time he cut his throat, the golden sarcoma quickly retreated and sank into his chest, as if it was accumulating strength. Dean's face was ugly. He covered his bleeding throat. If it weren't for his strong self-healing ability, he wouldn't have cut his throat so decisively. If he hesitated a little, this thing was likely to drill into his head. At that time, he couldn't imagine what would happen. This feeling reminded him of the first time he got the magic mark of Splitter. At that time, when Splitter's parasitic soul worm entered his body, it was also a living thing. It rushed to his brain. Fortunately, he blocked it in time, forcing the parasitic soul worm to retreat and return to the magic mark on his chest. He covered his throat to stop the bleeding. At the same time, he vigilantly looked at the golden sarcoma on his chest. His heart was full of regret. He shouldn't have eaten the flesh of the origami and put himself in such a big danger. However, it was useless to regret now. People would always regret when they encountered worse things. He would rather return to the previous situation. Perhaps when a worse situation appeared, he would be glad that the current bad situation was already very good. The golden sarcoma stayed in his chest for a while. Suddenly, it moved quickly again and slid to the back of Dean's neck. Dean immediately swung the dagger and cut the back of his neck. As long as it passed by, he would be able to pull it out. The golden sarcoma seemed to be aware of this. It quickly stopped and then slowly sank. After a while, it quickly rushed to Dean's throat again. Dean put his hand on his throat and waited for the impact. The golden sarcoma stopped halfway and then continued to move to the back of his neck. Dean protected his neck with both hands. Blood gushed out and dyed his palms red. He felt weaker and weaker. There was a trace of anxiety in his heart. He slowly used his fingers to repair the wound in his throat. At the same time, he felt a sense of dizziness due to lack of oxygen in his brain. After repeated attempts, the golden sarcoma seemed to know that it was too risky to rush to Dean's head. After it sank again, it did not stop. This time, it directly rushed to the magic mark on Dean's chest. The next moment, Dean felt that the magic mark on his chest seemed to be revived. It gently wriggled and confronted the golden sarcoma. Dean was shocked to see this scene, and his mind was almost blank. In his impression, the parasitic soul worm had died long ago and became a magic mark. But at this moment it came back to life. However, although it was alive, Dean found that it did not return to the appearance of a parasitic soul worm. Instead, it turned into a pool of dark slime like a worm, but also like a pool of conscious slime. It confronted the golden sarcoma, neither giving way to the other. The golden sarcoma did not hesitate and quickly rushed over. The sarcoma melted and turned into a pool of golden slime, entangling with the magic mark. The next moment, the dark magic mark was entangled with the golden liquid. The surface area of the golden liquid was getting bigger and bigger, but the dark magic mark was getting smaller and smaller. Until it was completely wrapped, it disappeared as if it was swallowed. Dean was stunned. Soon, he thought of one thing. Could it be that his magic mark was swallowed? He could no longer enter the splitter's body? Thinking of this, he was anxious. He immediately wanted to enter the splitter's body to verify it. But then he thought that if he entered the splitter's body, his body structure would change. If the golden sarcoma took advantage of this gap to drill into his brain, he might not be able to stop it in time. He resisted the urge to verify it and continued to watch. After the golden sarcoma wrapped the magic mark, there was no change in its size. It paused for a moment, then suddenly turned and rushed to the right arm. At this moment, Dean felt that the cold in his right arm seemed to have recovered. It was so cold that his body was shivering. The golden sarcoma quickly reached the right shoulder. Almost without hesitation, it rushed straight in. The tissues in the right arm were completely crystallized and looked like transparent ice cube. When the golden sarcoma rushed in, the cold in the arm became even stronger. The bones in the arm protruded with small sharp ice thorns, as if it was invaded by a foreign enemy. This scene was too strange. It was as if the right arm had its own consciousness. Dean was at a loss. But soon, he saw that the cold in the right arm covered the surface of the golden sarcoma. There were faint signs of freezing. The golden sarcoma seemed to feel that something was wrong. It stopped and retreated in the opposite direction. When it retreated to the right shoulder, the surface was completely frozen. Then the cold on the surface became thicker and thicker until it completely froze on the right shoulder. This series of changes made Dean frightened. At the same time, he felt a burst of cold. First, the golden sarcoma appeared inexplicably in his body like a germ. Then, there was a conscious change in his right arm. It made him feel that he could not understand his body. However, the changes in his right arm could also be a stimulated reaction, just like how water would boil when heated. If it was a stimulated reaction, then why would the golden sarcoma stimulate his right arm? At this time, there was a burst of dizziness. Dean quickly took out the first aid medicine from his backpack and smeared it on his throat. After a while, the cut throat and the crushed larynx gradually showed signs of healing. The first aid medicine he brought was the top medicine in the giant wall. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was a miracle medicine. While his throat was healing, Dean stared at the frozen golden sarcoma on his right arm and fell into deep thought. The cold in his right arm was caused by the excessive consumption of the cold crystal in the brain of the undead. The golden sarcoma should have appeared after eating the flesh of the origami. The cold would be stimulated by the golden sarcoma. There should be some connection between the two. After a long time, Dean suddenly woke up. He thought of his magic mark that was swallowed by the splitter. He glanced at his chest. The magic mark had disappeared. There was only a faint black mark. He quickly grabbed the sword and entered the demonic body according to the previous method. Chapter 856. How come? Dean stared at the hideous and ugly ice claw. For a moment, he was at a loss and doubtful. Before he stimulated the devil's body, his right arm was just a crystallized arm. But now it was completely a monster's claw. Although it was not so unusual with his devil's body, the key was, why could the devil's body affect the crystallization of his right arm? He raised his right arm and moved his fingers. Although his entire arm was as hard as ice, his fingers could move freely. He just couldn't feel anything. If he didn't see his fingers moving according to his will, he wouldn't even be able to feel his fingers moving. Ice was fragile. Dean did not know how much force the ice claw could withstand. He raised his hand and gently patted the rock wall next to him. He controlled his strength and tested the hardness of the ice claw first. Bang! Suddenly there was a loud noise. The sound was so loud that Dean, who was mentally prepared, did not expect it. He was shocked and looked at the scene in front of him. His ice claw was not broken. It was the rock wall that was broken. There was a claw mark nearly 1/2 meter deep on it. It was grim and cold, like the mark left by the claws of a monster. The gravel rolled to Dean's feet. After a few seconds, Dean came back to his senses. His eyes were full of shock. Only he knew how much strength he had used just now. It must be known that the thickness of the ice claw was very easy to break. Moreover, the ice claw had joints that were weak. Therefore, he only used a very light force, so light that he just wanted to touch it. But the result shocked him. He could not help but stretch out his sharp knife and touch the claw mark on the rock wall. The sharp knife had a perception. The clear, rough feeling made him know that he was not hallucinating. He could not help but look at his ice claw. Was it because he had no perception that his control of strength was a little vague? Did he use a lot of strength just now? But he carved every day, so he had a very accurate grasp of the strength of his right arm. He pondered for a moment and felt that it was necessary to test it again. He raised his sharp limb and walked to the rock wall next to him. He tried to chop it with medium strength. Bang! Bang! A few hoarse sounds of friction rang out as 3 cuts appeared on the rock wall. Due to the sharpness of the blade, the cuts were very thin but very deep. They were more than 1/2 meter deep, about the same depth as the previous ice claws. However, the area of damage was very different. In addition to the claw marks, the ice claws had also sunk the rock wall, while the sharp limb only left 3 deep and thin cuts on the rock wall. Dean lifted the ice claws again and went to the other side of the rock wall. "What are you doing?" Amelia stuck out half of her head from the corner. She looked at Dean's demonized body. She wasn't afraid but curiously asked. Dean glanced at her. "It's none of your business. Go back." Amelie frowned slightly and glanced at him. She didn't say anything and retreated. Dean retracted his gaze. This time, he intended to use a medium strength. Bang! Suddenly, there was a loud explosion. Dean's eyelids twitched as he looked at the cracked rock wall in front of him. It seemed that the entire rock wall was split by the gap of the claws. The entire protruding rock wall had caved in as if a super heavy truck had hit it. Dean quickly reacted and looked at his right hand. He was relieved to see that the ice claws weren't broken. He looked up and carefully observed the collapsed rock wall. His eyes slowly revealed a shocked look. His control of strength was correct. In his mind, his right hand and the sharp blade had the same strength, but the damage caused was more than 10 times more. This could only mean that his right arm was too developed. It was stronger than any other part of his body. He didn't continue trying. His gaze returned to his right arm and penetrated into it. His expression immediately changed. He saw that the frozen bones and tissues around the golden sarcoma on his right shoulder had a hint of gold, as if they had been dyed. Is it going to merge with my right arm? Or is it not completely frozen? Is it going to disperse its volume and gradually transfer? Dean's face turned ugly. He didn't feel happy about the strange power brought by his right arm. He thought for a moment and finally made up his mind to cut out the frozen golden sarcoma on his right shoulder. Although he guessed that the terrifying power of his right arm was probably related to the golden sarcoma, he didn't dare to be greedy for the power he got from the golden sarcoma. He still vividly remembered the scene of the golden sarcoma rushing to his brain. Fortunately, the golden sarcoma was frozen by the cold air in his right arm. Otherwise, he didn't dare to imagine how long he could hold on. Perhaps at this moment, the golden sarcoma had already drilled into his brain. He took a deep breath and raised the sharp blade. He gathered a little strength and suddenly stabbed the golden sarcoma on his right shoulder. Clang! Bang! 2 sounds were heard almost at the same time. The first sound was caused by the sharp blade stabbing the frozen right shoulder. The second sound was caused by the blade sliding from the right shoulder and stabbing the ground under his feet. Dean's face changed. He looked at his intact right shoulder in a daze. The indestructible splitting blade was actually unable to cut open his right shoulder? What kind of hardness was this? After a few seconds, Dean sobered up. There was a trace of panic in his heart. He lifted the four most powerful sharp blade limbs on his back, raised them high, aimed at his right shoulder, and fiercely stabbed. Bang! Dean's body fell to the ground, creating a pit in the ground. A cold feeling came from the front of the sharp blade limbs. Dean looked at his right shoulder and his heart sank. Just like what he felt from the sharp blade, it didn't pierce his right shoulder. Instead, the huge force knocked him down. His heart was piercing cold. Could it be that he could only let the golden sarcoma stay in his right arm? But now it showed signs of melting and spreading. If it moved out of his right arm and returned to his body, wouldn't his nightmare come? He couldn't accept such a thing. He gritted his teeth and stood up. He waved all the sharp blades and stabbed his right shoulder again. Bang! 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 He tried 7 or 8 times in a row, and fell down 7 or 8 times. Looking at his intact right shoulder with only a few shallow scratches, Dean's face was ashen. He slowly stood up, thinking in his heart, did he have to completely abandon his right arm? However, he would be left with only one arm. Although his splitter devil body had other blade-like limbs to assist him, and losing an arm wouldn't affect him much, it would still cause irreparable damage. If he were to encounter other sovereigns, he could very well lose to them if he lost an arm. He hesitated in his heart. He was reluctant, but he didn't want to let the strange golden sarcoma stay in his body. He silently leaned against the rock wall, his thoughts in chaos. A long time, he made a decision in the end. Judging from the changes in his right shoulder, the golden sarcoma shouldn't be able to come out in a short time. After he left the Earth Dragon Cave, he would most likely face a hard fight. At this time, cutting off his right arm was undoubtedly a very unfavorable thing. At least he had to get through this hurdle. He decided to do an operation on himself, an isolation operation. However, with the conditions in the cave, it was obviously impossible to complete this operation. He had to rely on the items in this village. If the alien spaceship had relatively high-technology medical equipment, and he happened to know how to use it, it could help him complete the internal isolation operation. After making the decision, he sat on the ground as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He felt cold sweat all over his body, but there was a trace of disappointment in his heart. In the pursuit of survival and strength, he had turned himself into this neither human nor ghost. He didn't know what his fate would be in the future, or would there be a future. This kind of thinking was a bit negative and made him depressed. He turned his head to look at Aisha, who was sitting quietly next to him. Her beautiful cheeks were like a snow lotus blooming in this dark and cold cave, illuminating his eyes. Fortunately, no matter how bad it is, I have you by my side. Chapter 857. In the following days, Dean didn't dare to eat the flesh of the origami, so as not to stimulate the golden sarcoma in his right shoulder. Without the flesh of the origami, Dean also lost his source of food. Fortunately, Aisha's wound was healing fast. It would take at most 1 or 2 days for her to be completely healed, and then they could leave this place. If it took longer for her to heal, it would take 4 or 5 days. He had to consider whether he should make an exception and get the food from Amelie. Seeing that the day of leaving the cave was approaching, Dean also began to prepare. He took the sealed jar that was used to suffocate the worm from Amelie, and came to the edge of the pool of silver mucus. When he was 2 meters away from it, the mucus slightly squirmed, as if it sensed the smell of life. From the edge, a finger-thick silver mucus protruded and stretched towards Dean's feet. Dean's eyes were dignified. The difference between the crystal worm and the other worms was not only in physique, but also in ability and vitality. Even the black giant worm of the pioneer level would die when its body was cut from the middle. However, the crystal worm maintained a terrifying vitality even in the state of melting into mucus. It seemed that as long as it got fresh flesh and nourishment, it could recover again. Moreover, these days Dean thought about a problem that he had neglected. The remains of the origami were well preserved, so what did these worms eat in this bare stone cave? This pool of mucus had been here for several days, and it hadn't eaten anything. Could it be that it could maintain a long feeding time without moving? Dean opened the sealed jar and put it on the ground in front of his feet. Then he picked up the sword and stabbed it into the silver mucus. It felt like stabbing into a piece of unobstructed water, and the tip of the sword directly pierced into the soil. Dean moved quickly, but found that the characteristics of the mucus were very similar to water. No matter how he cut it, in the blink of an eye, it would stick together again, and it could still squirm. No matter how sharp the sword was, it couldn't cut soft water. Dean saw that he couldn't hurt it, so he simply changed the method and moved it into the jar. Fortunately, the mucus was soft like water, so it was easy for Dean to move it. Although the process was a bit cumbersome, and he didn't have a spoon or other suitable tools, but relying on the wider sword, Dean smoothly moved the mucus around the jar. He split a pit next to the jar and moved the mucus into it. The mouth of the jar was just level with the ground, and then he moved the mucus into the jar. During this process, silver tentacles stretched out from the mucus from time to time and tried to grab Dean, but they were blocked by Dean's sword and sank back into the mucus. Half an hour later, the pool of silver mucus was all put into the jar. When the last bit was put into the jar, Dean did not wait for it to climb out again. He quickly covered the jar and crushed it. Dean clearly felt the vibration inside the jar after the jar was crushed. The jar gently shook, but the strength was not strong. The impact lasted for a while and then stopped. Dean pulled out the jar and put it aside. He didn't open it to check. He didn't care whether it was dead or alive. If the conditions were good, he would like to use it to study. But in his current situation, it was good enough to take this thing away from here. Although the crystal worm was big, but there wasn't much mucus after it melted. It was as if it was concentrated, and only the size of a basketball could fit it. It saved a lot of space for Dean. After storing the crystal worm's slime, Dean looked at the origami that was embedded in the rock wall. He felt that there was something strange about it, but he couldn't tell what it was. However, the most important thing to consider right now was how to take this thing away. The origami was nearly 10 meters tall, so it was naturally not feasible to carry it away. Moreover, the smell of the origami could attract terrible things from the abyss, so it must be packed in a sealed bag or box, just like the pieces of Sylvia's meat that he carried with him. He stood in front of the origami and looked at her from both sides. He estimated the thickness of the origami's body. He silently calculated in his mind. His backpack was 3 meters high, 2 meters thick and 2 meters wide. It was one of the largest backpacks that he used for hunting outside the giant wall. If he were to put the origami into the backpack, it would naturally not be able to fit. However, he was considering whether he could cut her into pieces, process her into neat pieces of meat, and then stack them in the backpack. However, looking at the thickness of the origami's body, especially the size of the lower body, it was a bit difficult for him to fit the origami with the capacity of his backpack. After thinking about it again and again, he decided to keep the complete body of the origami for the time being. He didn't want to destroy it. It was a big headache for him to leave this place. 2 days passed in the blink of an eye. Aisha's injury had finally recovered completely. Dean didn't cut the entire origami. He only cut off a part of the origami that was similar to a spider's leg and put it in the backpack. Then he took Amelie and Aisha to explore the outside of the cave. After leaving the depths of the cave, Dean returned to the passage. He suddenly found something strange. The huge origami's body that he had cut off was only fragmented pieces. The whole passage seemed very empty. When he rushed out of the passage, the origami's body was piled up to half a meter high. It was almost impossible to step on it. Dean frowned as he looked at Amelie. What happened? Amelie blinked her eyes and said innocently, How would I know? You ate it? Dean squinted his eyes. He noticed that Amelie's physique had reached the level of a pioneer. Such a speed of improvement was like riding a rocket. He suspected that if he let her eat more, she could directly become an abyss walker in this cave. Amelie rolled her eyes and said, Even if I were a pig, I wouldn't be able to eat so much. When I came to get it, I found that a lot of origami had disappeared. Every time I came to get it, I saw that a lot of them had disappeared. I guess they had crawled out of the passage to hide. Dean slightly frowned and glanced at the depths of the passage. Indeed, he hadn't seen Amelie leave the cave many times in the past few days. Even if she ate day and night, she couldn't eat so many origami. Moreover, although she had adapted to the origami, she wasn't very willing to eat it. Her appetite was limited. He stepped into the passage and slowly moved forward. He found that the number of origami was getting less and less. When he reached the passage that he had used to block the passage with coal, he found that the ordinary origami that he had killed had disappeared. The ground was very empty. There were only some origami that were as thick as a finger in the cracks of the rock wall. They were crawling weakly inside. Dean slightly raised his eyebrows. This situation was a bit strange. Did other villagers come in? But there was no smell of others here. He pondered for a moment and continued to move forward along the passage. After walking for a while, he suddenly saw a large dent on the ground. It was about half a meter wide and seemed to have been made by something circular. He squatted down and touched the dent. It was sticky. He took a sniff and realized that it was the mucus of a desolate worm. Chapter 858. Could it be that there is another great desolate worm here? Amelie was surprised. She also saw the huge dent on the ground. There seemed to be no other monsters in the cave besides the giant worm. Dean's eyes flashed. He thought for a moment and then continued to move forward. The slide marks moved forward along the passage until they reached a fork in the passage. The slide marks turned into a dead end on the other side of the passage. This passage was also explored by the villagers. The depth was relatively short and there were fewer giant worms living there. Dean glanced at the slide marks and used thermal vision to check. There was no heat source inside. The villagers who came to the cave should have already retreated. Usually, the exploration time was half a day. After all, the passage was only a few hundred meters deep. If it wasn't for the danger lurking around, half a day was enough for them to explore hundreds of times. Let's not go. Amelie secretly looked at Dean. Dean took back his eyes and nodded slightly. Even if Amelie didn't say anything, he wouldn't go to track the giant worm. From the slide marks he could predict its size. It was bigger than the crystal worm. Even if its strength wasn't at the dominator level, it was at least at the inner level. This worm was useless to him. It would be a waste of his physical strength to kill it. There was a trace of surprise in Amelia's eyes as she saw Dudian listen to her proposal. She couldn't help but look at him. Dean walked straight along the passage. The cave entrance was not far in front of him. After walking for dozens of meters, he saw a glimmer of light appear in his line of sight. He stopped and took out binoculars from the pocket of his backpack. Although he had night vision, but his vision couldn't be compared to daytime. At the moment he was in the cave, his line of sight was greatly reduced. He could only see a few dozen meters outside the cave entrance. "What is this?" Amelie curiously asked as she saw Dean pull out binoculars. Dean ignored her and looked through the binoculars. He saw that there were several heavily armed generals with tattoos in front of the green grass outside the cave entrance. There were no villagers gathered outside. It was very empty. But in this empty place there were two strange haystacks. They were 3 or 4 meters high. The haystacks were not neatly built. Why were there 2 haystacks here? Dean frowned slightly. He moved forward a little more than 10 meters and looked through the haystack. The next moment, his face changed dramatically. He quickly retreated to the previous place, and his back was overflowing with cold sweat. Amelie's heart sank as she saw Dean's nervous appearance. But her face remained unchanged. What's wrong? Dean looked at Amelia and returned to the cave. Let's go. Amelie was startled. She turned around to look at the outside of the cave. Her eyes were complicated and hesitant. This was a rare chance to get out of this place. The way out was right in front of her, and her power had greatly increased. After hesitating for less than 2 seconds, she retracted her gaze and turned to follow Dean into the cave. In the past few days, whenever her strength improved, she secretly tested her skills. She knew that she was still far from Dean. If she ran away, she would definitely be caught by Dean. They went through the passage and returned to the deepest part of the cave. Dean stopped. His face was gloomy as he saw the things in the haystack. He was so scared that he almost screamed out loud. His conjecture was true. It was 2 cannons. Moreover, the cannons weren't loaded with gunpowder. Although the appearance was similar, but he found that the cannons had a built-in energy board. If he wasn't wrong, it should be a laser cannon. Only such a weapon would need a built-in energy board. Although the possibility wasn't very certain, but it was very high. He didn't dare to verify it himself. No matter how fast he was, he couldn't be faster than the speed of the laser cannon. He was secretly glad that he had surveyed in advance. Otherwise, the moment he stepped out of the cave, the laser cannon would blast his head, and he would die instantly. 2 haystacks and 2 laser cannons. It was possible that they wanted to snipe him and Aisha at the same time. At first, he saw that the place where the great priest lived had modern technology. He guessed that there would be laser guns and other weapons. He didn't expect that the other party would directly pull out 2 laser cannons. Such a weapon could even kill an abyss-level monster. Of course, the premise was that they had to aim at the vital parts. Dean didn't know the specific effect of these 2 suspected laser cannons. He didn't know if they could be loaded 1 shot at a time or stored energy for multiple shots. If they could be fired continuously, the value of these 2 laser cannons would be frighteningly high. If it was only the laser cannons, Dean wouldn't be scared to retreat directly. If it was an ordinary person who operated the laser cannons, he could easily predict the shooting position from the operator's movements and dodge. But if these 2 laser cannons were operated by the pioneer-level masters, he could only take it. Since there is such a thing, then my previous conjecture should be right. There are alien spaceships or spaceship-like things here with very advanced technology. However, the people here don't seem to have learned anything from it. They only know how to use it, but they don't know how to analyze it and use it to develop themselves. Dean's eyes flashed. This phenomenon was very important. They only knew how to use it, but they didn't know how to apply it to their daily lives. It showed that the people here didn't know much about these things. It seems that your means are more powerful than I thought. Dean's eyes flashed. He looked down at Amelie and sneered. And you are ruthless enough. Do you plan to bury me? Amelie's heart jumped. She pretended not to understand. What did you say? The great priest ambushed me outside. Do you know about this? Dean looked at her. What do you think I should do now? Amelie was at a loss. What ambush? What did you say? Don't act. It's a waste of time. Dean stared at her. The trap is ready outside. But I want to know where you got the 2 cannons. Is it inside the thing above our heads? He raised his hand and pointed to the dome. Amelie's face suddenly changed. She quickly realized that her expression was exposed. She immediately turned her head and said, I don't understand what you are talking about. I have seen it. Do you still want to act? Dean glanced at her and said to himself, The lights on top of your village are so bright. You need a lot of energy. In addition to solar energy, I really can't think of where to install a power station. I want to see the place where the lights are connected. Chapter 859. Beam Cannon? Dudian asked. Did you get this thing from above? Amelie frowned. She knew that he was referring to the dome. That was the biggest secret of their tribe. She didn't expect that Dudian would see through it. Most people would marvel at the magical light of the dome, but they wouldn't think about the thing behind the light. It seemed that Dudian had seen something similar. If that was the case, then it wasn't surprising that he could see through it at a glance. Moreover, from this point, she knew that Dean most likely had this thing in the God's Wall. This made her a little vigilant. Their biggest reliance was this thing. If there was a similar thing in the God's Wall, then they would inevitably suffer a big loss if they migrated to the God's Wall and there was a war. Her thoughts drifted away as she thought about it. Dudian didn't urge her as he came to the side and sat down to rest. I don't know how much spirit of sacrifice you have, but you have two choices. First, you try to perish together with me. Then you die and I'll live and take revenge on your tribe. Second, you cooperate with me. I'll give you the map to the wall after I leave this place. As for how to verify the authenticity of the map, I think you should have a way. Otherwise you wouldn't have been so anxious to hand over the map. Amelie's heart sank as she looked at Dudian, who was sitting on the ground. These days she had seen the scheming mind of this teenager, who was only a few years older than her. She sneered. Why should I perish together with you? Why would you survive if I die? If you didn't hold me hostage, then you would be dead by now. Once I die, you will be buried with me. Dean seemed to be very patient. Although you have 2 light cannons and can kill me, but it seems that the great priest only wants to ambush us. He doesn't intend to push the cannons directly into the cave. The sacrifice would be too big, and it would destroy the foundation of this place. It might also destroy the origami that you believe in. Of course, this is just my guess. But one thing is certain. If you push the 2 light cannons into the cave, then it would be very difficult to kill me. Unless you have the ESP locking ability. Amelia knew that Dean was right. This was the reason why she was depressed and aggrieved. She thought that she could kill Dean by surprise with the beam cannon. She didn't expect that Dean would be able to see through it. This was an ambush. What was the point of talking about an ambush if it was seen through? Even if you are right, but you won't be able to take half a step out of this cave without me. Amelie's momentum didn't retreat. She had grown a lot in just a few days. She looked into Dudian's eyes. You are after all a human and you have to eat. If I'm not wrong, then you can't eat the worm or the origami's body. Humph. I don't believe that you can stay here for a lifetime. Oh. Dudian looked at her. It seems that you are also secretly paying attention to me? Amelie snorted and disdained to answer. Dudian didn't care about her attitude. You are right. I'm a human after all. But because I'm a human, I know that if a road doesn't work, then I have to find another way. Since I can't leave from the exit, then I can dig a way out from anywhere. But the place I want to go the most is above. Amelie's pupils shrank. She felt a chill in her heart. Why didn't she think of this before? No wonder Dudian didn't panic after seeing the beam cannons. It turned out that he had already thought of this way of retreat. However, the great priest who was outside didn't think of this. This was a serious omission in their plan. What made her even more disappointed was that if the great priest relied on the 2 light cannons to guard the hole, then Dean could use this method to sneak out without being noticed. She miscalculated, and the great priest also miscalculated. She knew this point, but she couldn't inform the great priest. She couldn't rush out and shout. It was estimated that her mouth would be pinched by Dudian as soon as she shouted the first word. How could she inform the great priest so that she could respond as soon as possible? Amelie's eyes slightly turned as she thought about it. Dudian quietly looked at her and didn't say anything. His eyes made Amelie come back to her senses. She looked at Dudian's calm expression and asked, "Why are you looking at me?" "I'm waiting for you to figure it out." Figure out what? Figure out your own result. What result? Amelie's face sank. Anyway, I'm already in your hands. You can kill me if you want, but don't think about insulting me. Dudian shook his head. If you want to inform the great priest and let her ambush me, then you will die and I will live. Then I will leave this place. What's the meaning of such a result for you? What's the meaning for your people? Do you want to set up a dangerous enemy? Amelie's eyes were gloomy. Why are you so sure that you can escape from here? Dudian continued to shake his head but didn't answer. If you are willing to cooperate with me, then you will not only get the wall map, but also one less enemy like me. This is the most cost-effective deal. Although you are young, but at least you should understand this point. You. Amelia was angry. She didn't know how many times she had been ridiculed by Dean's poisonous tongue. She was already indifferent, but after the beam ambush failed, her mood became impetuous again. Aren't you very capable? Why do you want me to cooperate with you? For the time being, I don't need your cooperation. Maybe I will need it when I go to the top. I hope you will be tactful at that time. Dudian calmly said. Amelie was angry again. She turned to look at the rock wall, but her mind was thinking about how to inform the great priest about the news. Dean glanced at her and didn't say anything. He got up and walked towards the origami, who was in the deepest part of the cave. He entered the demon's body state. His body was covered with sharp blades. He waved his limbs and climbed up the rock wall. Using the sharp blades as a shovel, he cut open the rock wall. Dudien's attention fell on Amelie, who was still in front of the passage. He frowned as he saw her stay there. Why aren't you coming over? Amelie slowly came over when she heard the sound. Her face changed as she saw Dudian hanging upside down on the top of the rock wall like a spider. There was a trace of anxiety in her eyes. Dudian glanced at her and continued to chisel the wall. Soon he had chiseled more than 20 meters deep. He saw a piece of metal in front of him through his X-ray vision. Without any hesitation, he waved the sharp blade to cut it. With a clanging sound, the sharp blade cut on the metal, but was unable to split it open. There was only an extremely shallow white scratch. According to this kind of damage, it would probably take 1,000,000 slashes at the same place before it could be destroyed. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.